Before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button like it just confessed your secrets to the internet. And in the comments, tell me this. What's one truth you've been avoiding admitting to yourself lately? Don't worry, this is a safe space. Mostly. They say silence is peace, but that's a lie. Silence can rot you from the inside out. It can fester like a wound that never scabs, until every heartbeat feels like a reminder of something you never said. That's how the first confessions began. Not with faith, not with theology, but with the unbearable weight of keeping quiet. Imagine a man in a stone room 1,000 years ago, shaking as if his soul were leaking through his fingers. He doesn't know what to call it, guilt, fear, or madness, but he needs to let it out. So he speaks. Just one sentence. And in that moment, he invents something sacred. Relief. The funny thing about guilt is that it doesn't always make sense. You can do nothing wrong and still feel condemned. Maybe that's why people started confessing. Not to cleanse their sins, but to prove they were still human. To show someone, anyone, that they could hurt and still be worth forgiving. Even today, you'll see people pouring their hearts out to strangers online, as if the Wi-Fi signal could absolve them. They write things they wouldn't whisper to their own mirror. It's a desperate form of prayer, typed instead of spoken. And it's oddly beautiful if you think about it, how technology just reinvented the oldest ritual in the world. But in the beginning, confession wasn't about words, it was about survival. Ancient tribes believed that unspoken wrongs poisoned the group, that if you held your secrets, the spirits would turn against you. There are stories of villagers confessing to rivers, asking the current to carry away their shame. Others whispered to trees, because trees, unlike people, don't judge. They just keep growing. Somewhere along the way, humanity realized that saying something out loud didn't only remove the guilt, it created connection. The secret lost its power once it was shared. That was the real miracle. Of course, the church later saw an opportunity in this very human weakness. If confession could heal, why not make it sacred? Why not institutionalize it? Soon, whispering in the dark to a trusted friend turned into kneeling before a priest behind a wooden screen. Privacy became doctrine. The sound of sin turned into the soundtrack of salvation. And if you've ever been inside an old cathedral during confession hour, you know what that feels like. The hush, the heavy air, the faint scent of incense that makes guilt smell holy. People walked in trembling and came out lighter even if they hadn't changed a single thing in their lives. That's the paradox. Sometimes, the ritual heals more than the repentance. Psychologists today might laugh at that. They'd say it's just emotional regulation, a primitive form of therapy. But isn't that what most of religion is? A structured way of talking to someone who won't interrupt. And here's where the comedy of human nature kicks in. People will pay hundreds of dollars for therapy sessions, but they once lined up for free to whisper their sins to someone who couldn't even look them in the eye. Maybe the church invented the first customer service hotline for the soul. Press 1 for envy, 2 for lust. And please stay on the line. Your forgiveness is important to us. Still, there's something deeper, something the cynics miss. Confession wasn't just about unburdening the soul. It was a performance of vulnerability. To confess is to risk being seen, truly seen, and that's terrifying. Have you ever noticed how people confess small things first? Like dipping their toes into the water before diving? Forgive me, Father, for I have gossiped. That's the polite version of, forgive me, Father, I'm drowning. The ritual gave people permission to be fragile in a world that demanded strength. It was the only place weakness was holy. And yet, it's easy to forget how dangerous it once was to speak truth aloud. In medieval times, the wrong confession could cost your life. Some believed that demons listened from the shadows, ready to twist your words. So people learned to confess carefully, wrapping sin in poetry and metaphor, saying enough to be forgiven, but not enough to be damned. Even now, we do that in subtler ways. When someone says, I'm fine, what they really mean is, I'm confessing, but not to you. It's the human condition, always desperate to tell the truth, but terrified of the consequences. The first true confessions weren't even religious, they were desperate. Soldiers before battle admitting fears they'd never told their comrades. Mothers whispering regrets to sleeping children. Lovers telling the truth only after losing everything. These were not acts of piety, but of survival. Because sometimes keeping a secret is heavier than sin itself. The early church fathers just gave that instinct a name. They built a structure around it and told people that God was listening. Maybe he was. Or maybe it was humanity finally learning to listen to itself. There's an ancient saying, no one dies with a full heart. In the end, everything leaks out. The truth, the lies, the hidden hunger to be understood. Maybe that's why confession never died, only changed form. From cathedrals to confession apps, from whispered prayers to late-night voice messages we wish we hadn't sent, we still confess every day, just not always to priests. We confess to screens, to strangers, to ourselves in the shower. Every, I shouldn't say this, but is a modern, forgive me, Father. Every secret we spill is a small resurrection. It's tragic and hilarious how predictable we are. The moment we say, I'll never tell anyone, we start dying to tell someone. Maybe the real sin isn't what we did, but thinking we could carry it alone. Humans weren't built for silence. We need witnesses, even for our worst moments, because without them, the pain has nowhere to go and the soul becomes an echo chamber of regret. That's how the first confessions were born, not from holiness, but from the simple, stubborn human need to stop hurting alone. And somewhere, between guilt and grace, between laughter and tears, we discovered that the act of confessing wasn't just about being forgiven, it was about feeling real. The silence broke and humanity learned to breathe again. Somewhere in the long corridor of human history, guilt became fashionable. Not the kind of guilt that makes you apologize to your neighbor for stealing their newspaper, but the spiritual kind, the kind that makes you wonder if God is taking notes while you sleep. When people began to believe their thoughts could condemn them, silence was no longer enough. They needed a way to drain the poison, to put a name on the invisible weight pressing against their chests. And so, humanity invented confession again and again, each time with a different costume. A whisper in a temple, a tear on a monk's shoulder, a message left unread at 3 a.m. There's something beautifully tragic about how we never outgrow the need to be forgiven. A child says, "I didn't mean to break it." An adult says, "I didn't mean to hurt you." Both are confessions dressed for their age. The ritual evolves, but the ache is the same. Ancient texts tell us that even before formal religion, tribes had purification rituals, ceremonies where people admitted their wrongs not to be punished, but to keep the group in harmony. Imagine a bonfire in the dark, a circle of faces, the sound of the river close by. Each person steps forward and speaks their truth, knowing tomorrow they'll still have a place by the fire. That's what real forgiveness looks like, not forgetting the wrong, but choosing to share the same warmth anyway. Over centuries, as faith systems grew more structured, confession became less about the tribe and more about the soul. The church turned it into an art form. Wooden confessionals appeared like little boxes of grace where whispers were traded for absolution. Some people even competed to see who had the most dramatic sins to tell, as if holiness could be measured by the size of your regrets. The irony? Many of those listening behind the lattice had sins just as colorful. But that's the strange democracy of guilt. It spares no one. It unites the pure and the corrupt, the beggar and the bishop, in a shared understanding that we all have things we wish we hadn't done. There's a story about a medieval priest who used to laugh softly during confessions. When asked why, he said, "Because after 30 years, it's always the same stories, only different names." He wasn't mocking anyone. He was simply acknowledging that human nature doesn't evolve as fast as we think. Envy, lust, pride, deceit, these are the original apps that never needed an update. Maybe that's why the act of confessing feels eternal. Because our mistakes, in essence, never change. The faces of the guilty change, the languages change, but the melody of remorse remains hauntingly familiar. Modern psychology would later give this an elegant name, catharsis. Freud, for example, noticed that when his patients spoke freely about their secrets, their symptoms often vanished, at least for a while. He didn't call it confession, of course. He called it the talking cure. But if you stripped away the jargon, it was the same ancient medicine. Speak and be lighter. Maybe Freud just put a couch where the church had placed a cross. Both offered comfort, both listened, and both charged a price. One in coins, the other in repentance. The real comedy, though, is that humans still manage to feel guilty about confessing badly. People leave therapy saying, "I think I didn't explain myself well," the same way penitents once left church muttering, "I don't think he really believed me." It's almost poetic. Our guilt even makes us feel guilty about how we express our guilt. But beneath that absurdity lies a profound truth. Confession isn't about the listener. It's about the courage it takes to speak. It's the internal act of saying, "All right, I can face myself now." And that moment, brief as it is, feels divine. Even outside religion, we've built new confessionals. Social media is one of them. Every viral post that begins with, "I've never told anyone this before," is a digital sacrament. The comments section becomes a modern congregation handing out heart emojis instead of Hail Marys. People confess not to be forgiven, but to be witnessed. Because if someone else has heard your secret, it feels less monstrous, less alien. It becomes a shared story instead of a private curse. Yet the paradox remains. While millions confess online every day, few actually listen. The ancient balance between confessor and witness is lost in the noise of scrolling thumbs. There's a quiet truth here. Confession, in its purest form, isn't about religion or even morality. It's about rhythm. The rhythm of holding and releasing, inhaling and exhaling. When you confess, you breathe out what was poisoning your air. You make space for something new, sometimes forgiveness, sometimes understanding, sometimes just peace. And peace, contrary to what we believe, doesn't always mean being good. It means being whole. Even our worst mistakes can belong to us without defining us. The whisper in the confessional, the therapy session, the text never sent, all of them are tiny acts of reclaiming the self. In monasteries, some monks used to confess to the walls when no priest was around. They believed that truth itself was holy enough to carry their words to heaven. Maybe that's the most honest version of confession. Speaking not for forgiveness, but because silence hurts too much. It reminds us that we're human, not machines. And humans, for all their wisdom, have one tragic flaw. They feel before they think, and confess only when it's too late. That's why we still whisper our regrets to the dark, long after religion has faded, long after the priest is gone. If you think about it, the entire history of humanity could be summarized as one long confession. Every book, every song, every painting is someone saying, "This is what I've done. This is what I've felt. Please understand me." And maybe that's the most sacred truth of all, that confession isn't a ritual of weakness, but of creation. It's how we turn shame into story, pain into art, guilt into something that breathes. The first person to confess wasn't seeking salvation. They were inventing meaning. And in that invention, they gave the rest of us a way to survive ourselves. Because no matter how far we evolve, there will always be that moment, late at night, in the stillness before sleep, when something inside us whispers, "Say it." Not to the world, not even to God, but to the quiet place inside that still believes in redemption. And that whisper, fragile yet relentless, is what keeps us human. They say that sin made humans need confession, but maybe it was the other way around. Maybe confession made us believe in sin. The moment we found comfort in admitting our flaws, someone realized that guilt could be organized, measured, labeled, monetized. It's strange how easily human pain becomes a system. What began as a whisper of relief slowly turned into a ledger of offenses, tallied by men who wore robes and promised salvation for a price. Somewhere in that evolution, a quiet secret emerged. Confession wasn't just a spiritual act, it was the birth of psychological power. Whoever you confess to owns a piece of your soul. In the medieval world, confession was a performance as much as a ritual. Peasants knelt before priests, trembling as if the air itself could judge them. The wooden booth became a portal between fear and forgiveness, and the priest, the only one allowed to hear the truth, held the keys to both heaven and hell. The irony is that this design wasn't divine, it was architectural genius. The confessional box muffled voices, but amplified control. And people entered it willingly, convinced that freedom waited on the other side. What a delicious paradox. You kneel to be liberated. It's like trying to fly by chaining yourself to the sky. Over time, confessions became almost poetic. Sinners began to confess not only what they had done, but what they had felt. They described temptations, dreams, and thoughts as if every flicker of desire required an apology. It was the age when morality invaded the imagination. You could be punished for fantasies you never acted upon, mental crimes against holiness. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing even your dreams could betray you. It's no wonder the world became obsessed with purity. When your mind is a crime scene, guilt becomes a way of life. And yet, for all its weight, there was beauty in the act. The confessional was one of the few places where the poor and the powerful knelt at the same level. A king could confess to a murder, and a farmer could confess to stealing bread, and both would whisper to the same wooden wall. It was democracy before democracy. In a way, the church unintentionally invented equality, just not the kind it meant to. Everyone, no matter how high or low, had a voice trembling behind that same curtain. The only difference was that some sins echoed louder in history books. Then came the strange twist. Confession turned outward. Instead of priests, poets and writers became the new confessors. Augustine had started it centuries before, turning his sins into literature in The Confessions, the world's first spiritual autobiography. Later came Rousseau, who stripped his soul naked on paper for the sake of authenticity, though it often sounded more like vanity. People began to realize that writing your sins could be more powerful than whispering them. Words on a page don't forget you as easily as priests do. And unlike priests, readers can't grant absolution. They can only understand, which might be even better. There's a strange comedy in how each era finds new furniture for the same old ritual. The medievals had booths, the romantics had diaries, and we have microphones. Today, podcasts and talk shows are filled with confessions disguised as entertainment. I'm just being honest, someone says, moments before revealing their entire childhood trauma to millions of strangers. Honesty, it seems, is the new religion, and the audience has become the congregation. Maybe we don't seek forgiveness anymore. We seek followers who will comment, "You're so brave." Forgiveness used to cleanse the soul. Now it boosts engagement. Still, something ancient lingers beneath the modern noise. Deep down, we still crave to be witnessed, not just heard. There's a difference. To be heard is to make sound. To be witnessed is to exist. That's why even when people confess anonymously online, they secretly hope someone out there recognizes them between the lines. It's the same impulse that drove monks to carve their sins into confession stones, tiny etchings left in secret caves in Ireland and Spain where no one would ever see them except maybe God or time itself. Imagine that kind of faith, confessing into silence, believing the universe will nod in response. What fascinates me most is how confession reshaped our relationship with truth. Once, truth was dangerous. It could get you burned, exiled, or worse. But confession offered a loophole. If you revealed your sin first, you could control the narrative. You could sin and still look noble for admitting it. The church may have offered absolution, but the real prize was reputation management. Even today, we use the same logic. Politicians apologize publicly before scandals break. Influencers post teary videos saying, "I made mistakes, but I've grown." We've mastered the art of sinning gracefully. Yet, despite all the manipulation and performance, confession remains one of the few acts that can still strip a person down to something real. There's a moment, brief, trembling, and raw, when a human voice cracks under the weight of its own honesty. You can't fake that sound. It's the soul coughing. That moment is older than religion. It's the sound of evolution, the brain learning to shed emotional toxins. Scientists might call it a neurological reset, but it feels more like grace. That's the secret the ancient world already knew. Confession doesn't make you holy, it makes you human again. And perhaps that's why people keep returning to it in one form or another. Because when you speak your truth, even imperfectly, the world seems to breathe with you. For a second, the walls stop closing in, and you realize you were never meant to carry your sins alone. Maybe that's what God wanted all along. Not obedience, but honesty. Not perfection, but presence. The world changes, the rituals fade, but the need remains the same. We keep whispering into darkness, hoping something, or someone, whispers back. There's an unspoken irony in all of this. The more humanity evolved, the louder our confessions became. From silent prayers to megaphones of emotion, we're still chasing that same quiet relief the first sinner felt when they dared to speak. Maybe confession isn't about washing away the past, but about reminding ourselves that we're still here, still flawed, still trying. And in that effort, in that vulnerable laugh between tears, there's something sacred. A proof that the divine never left us. It just changed its address, moving from the heavens into the fragile rhythm of our own trembling voices. They say the walls of old churches have heard more truth than any courtroom ever will. You can almost imagine them humming softly with the weight of centuries of secrets, voices trembling through the wood, whispers turning into dust. It's funny how human beings trust walls more than each other. Maybe because walls don't interrupt. They don't gasp or raise eyebrows. They just absorb. And for some, that was enough. A listener who never judged, never forgot, and never left. In those dark corners of stone and silence, people began to believe that speaking could rewrite destiny, that words could change the direction of eternity. But the truth is, confession was never only about forgiveness. It was about power. Not just the church's power over the sinner, but the sinner's brief moment of control over their own story. The act of speaking your sin aloud gave it shape, and once it had shape, it could be handled, turned over, examined, maybe even understood. Before that, guilt was just fog. Once confessed, it became clay. And clay, unlike fog, can be molded. That was the quiet genius of confession. It transformed chaos into narrative. A sinner became a storyteller, and in that transformation, humanity discovered something almost mystical, the ability to edit its own soul. Of course, not everyone used that power kindly. There were priests who treated confession like a social ladder, collecting secrets like currency. Some used them to manipulate nobles, to sway kings, to build empires from whispers. History is full of men who ruled not with swords, but with what they knew. The confessional booth was, in many ways, the first intelligence agency, but even so, the booth itself wasn't evil. Like all great inventions, its morality depended on the hands that used it. It's a bit like fire. One person uses it to cook, another to burn, and still we keep lighting the match. As centuries passed, the tone of confession changed again. It began to move away from ritual and into psychology. By the 19th century, people were confessing not to save their souls, but to soothe their minds. The priest's robe turned into a therapist's chair. Yet the impulse was the same, someone to listen, someone to understand. If you think about it, Freud was just a man who took the confessional out of the church and put it in an office with better lighting. And instead of Hail Marys, you got homework. The therapy session became a modern cathedral where people still knelt, only now they called it lying down on the couch. What's ironic is that even with all our science and progress, the human urge to confess hasn't gone away, it's multiplied. We confess to our friends over coffee, to our phones and late-night voice notes, to millions of strangers online. We build entire platforms just to say, here's what I did, here's who I am, please don't hate me for it. It's as if confession is our most natural form of self-expression, and denial is the only thing we've ever needed to be taught. The ancients feared punishment from God, but we fear the comment section. One slip, one wrong sentence, and your digital absolution evaporates. Yet still we talk, as if we can't help it, and maybe we can't. There's something profoundly human about needing to be known, even in our worst moments. A secret is heavy precisely because it isolates. When you confess, you're no longer alone inside your own head. Someone else has seen the monster, and if they don't run, you start to believe maybe you're not a monster after all. That's why some people describe confession as a kind of rebirth. The world looks a little different when you're no longer the only one carrying your darkness. Maybe that's what redemption really is, not erasing what we've done, but sharing the weight of it until it no longer crushes us. Of course, there's also the awkward comedy of confession, the human tendency to overshare in the wrong moment. Someone at a dinner party suddenly blurts, "I cheated on my taxes," and everyone freezes with a fork halfway to their mouth. It's almost endearing, this inability to hold things in. We're creatures who long for connection, but we're terrible at timing it. Confession is a clumsy dance between truth and regret, and most of us have two left feet. Yet those messy moments are often the ones that make us most alive. When someone blurts out something real, even by accident, the air shifts. The performance breaks, life starts again. It's interesting to think how confession turned into art. Every great painting, every novel worth reading, every song that makes you cry. It's all confession disguised as creativity. Artists pour out what they can't say directly, transforming shame into color, guilt into melody. Van Gogh confessed with brushstrokes, Sylvia Plath with poems, Johnny Cash with music. They all spoke their truths in different languages, but the goal was the same, to be free, even for a moment. Maybe that's why art lasts longer than religion, because it doesn't demand repentance, only recognition. But for all its beauty, confession is dangerous too. Once you tell the truth, you can't untell it. Words have a way of escaping their cages. Think of all the diaries found after death, all the letters never meant to be read, all the recorded voices that outlived their owners. There's a ghostliness to confession. It lingers in rooms long after the speaker is gone. Maybe that's why people used to burn their journals or whisper only to the wind. We want to be known, but we fear being remembered for the wrong reasons. The line between healing and haunting is thinner than we think. And yet, the most haunting confessions are the ones never spoken. The words swallowed, the apologies rehearsed but never delivered, the truths buried beneath years of pretending. Psychologists call it repression. Poets call it tragedy. Either way, the result is the same, a heart that beats out of rhythm with itself. You can hide your sins, but the body always tells on you. Insomnia, anxiety, that strange ache behind your ribs when you see something that reminds you of what you did. It's the body's way of saying, you can lie to everyone else, but not to me. The human nervous system is the most honest priest in existence. What's fascinating, though, is how confession isn't only about wrongdoing, it's about transformation. Every time we speak our truth, something inside us shifts, rearranges, realigns. It's why so many people describe crying after finally telling a secret they've held for years. The tears aren't weakness, they're recalibration. They're the body updating its emotional software after running on guilt for too long. It's as if, deep down, we know that confession isn't about cleansing the past, but unlocking the future. Each truth spoken makes space for something else to grow. And so, even after centuries of evolving rituals, from stone altars to smartphone screens, confession remains the same at its core, a deeply human ritual of rebirth through honesty. It's not about God or punishment or even forgiveness. It's about finding a voice strong enough to say, "This is who I am," and realizing that maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The miracle isn't in being absolved, it's in not disappearing. Because when we speak, when we dare to tell our story, even the ugly parts, we keep the world from forgetting that behind every sin, there's still a soul trying to find its way home. There's a strange moment that happens after you confess. The world doesn't explode. The sky doesn't darken. Lightning doesn't strike. No divine hand reaches down to write your punishment in stone. You look around, expecting everything to fall apart, and instead, it's quiet. It's almost disappointing, really. We build our secrets into monsters so enormous that when they finally leave our mouths, we expect an apocalypse. But what we get is silence. And in that silence, something unfamiliar begins to move. Relief. It's awkward at first because peace feels foreign when you've lived too long with noise. But it's there, subtle as a sigh, waiting to be trusted. That's the thing no one tells you about confession. It doesn't erase what happened. It just changes the temperature of it. The past stops burning quite so hot. You can still feel its edges, but it no longer scalds. It's like touching an old scar. The pain has left, but the story remains. Some people think that's weakness, that forgiveness means pretending it never happened. But true forgiveness, whether divine or human, is far less glamorous. It's not fireworks, it's more like laundry. You keep washing the same shirt over and over until the stain fades enough for you to wear it again without shame. It's boring, repetitive, and utterly necessary. And maybe that's why confession became more than ritual. It became rhythm. A cycle of falling, speaking, rising, and falling again. The church simply formalized what humans were already doing in their hearts, falling apart and trying again. Every era redressed this cycle in its own costume. In medieval times, people feared God's wrath. Today, we fear being misunderstood. Either way, we confess to stay alive because silence, left too long, kills faster than guilt. You can survive sin, you can't survive suppression. And perhaps that's what the earliest believers intuited when they whispered to priests or rivers or walls. They weren't asking for heaven, they were asking to breathe. Of course, there's an absurd side to this. Humans can confess anything if given enough time. There are documented cases of people confessing to crimes they didn't commit simply because they couldn't handle the tension of not being believed. One man in the 17th century admitted to witchcraft because he felt guilty about stealing bread decades earlier. It's almost comical, the way guilt distorts memory. Our brains would rather fabricate a grand sin than sit quietly with small regret. We're drama queens of morality. It's what makes us fascinating and exhausting. Even the saints weren't immune. St. Augustine's Confessions reads less like theology and more like an overlong diary entry written at 3 a.m. "I stole some pears," he writes, and you can almost feel him overthinking it. Did he steal them out of hunger? No. Out of rebellion? Maybe. Out of boredom? Almost certainly. The detail is both tragic and funny. This man helped shape Western Christianity, and he's haunted by fruit theft. But that's the beauty of confession. It equalizes. The mighty and the mundane share the same human itch to unburden. And centuries later, that pear story still lingers, proof that even geniuses can't escape the ridiculousness of guilt. There's also something deeply theatrical about how we expect redemption to look. We want thunderclaps, violins, maybe a slow pan to a sunset. But in reality, redemption is quiet. It's an old woman washing dishes, humming to herself after forgiving her son. It's a man taking off his wedding ring, placing it gently on the table, and saying, "I think I understand now." These aren't dramatic moments, they're small revolutions. Confession opens the door, but redemption walks through it barefoot, softly, unannounced. And sometimes it takes years to realize it was there at all. Psychologists today talk about emotional regulation, but ancient confessions were already doing that, just without the PowerPoint slides. The process was simple. Name the chaos, give it shape, and suddenly it becomes smaller than you. The act of naming has always been humanity's way of taming fear. We did it with gods, storms, diseases, and sins. It's how we turn the unknown into something we can sit across from. And maybe that's why confession never disappears. It's less about guilt than about language. The moment you speak your pain, it becomes part of the human dictionary. Someone else can recognize it. Someone else can say, "Me too." But there's a darker truth hiding underneath. Confession alone doesn't save us. It can even become a trap. Some people get addicted to confessing without ever changing. They chase absolution like a drug, desperate for that temporary high of being forgiven. It's the spiritual version of clearing browser history. Everything looks clean, but nothing's different. That's when confession stops being sacred and starts being escapism. Because the point of saying sorry isn't to feel lighter, it's to live differently afterward. Otherwise, all you've done is redecorate your guilt. And redecorated guilt still stings the same. Yet there's a strange grace in realizing that even failure has beauty. To confess is to say, "I tried. Maybe you failed miserably. Maybe you broke things you can't fix, but you're still showing up to your own life." That's no small thing. In fact, it might be the closest thing to holiness we have left, the courage to keep showing up. Modern life doesn't give us many sacred spaces, so we improvise. The bathroom mirror becomes a confessional. The long walk after a fight, the journal you'll never show anyone. Every time we speak our truth into those spaces, we reenact something ancient, something human. We are both priest and penitent, both judge and forgiven. And if you look closely, you'll see confession everywhere, in the way someone hesitates before saying, "I love you," or how another pauses before admitting, "I was wrong." Every honest conversation is a micro-confession, a tiny leap into vulnerability. The more we leap, the more alive we become, because confession, at its core, is an act of trust. It says, "Here's my truth, do what you will with it." It's terrifying, but it's also liberation disguised as risk. And perhaps that's why laughter often follows tears in those moments. It's the body realizing it survived honesty. In the end, all of humanity's history of confession, religious, artistic, psychological, boils down to one instinct: to be known and still be loved. That's what every whispered prayer and every viral post is really asking for: to stand in the raw light of truth and not be turned away. To see that even after all the mistakes, the shame, the endless cycles of falling and rising, there's still a place at the table. Confession doesn't fix the past. It humanizes it. It turns pain into testimony. And maybe that's the final paradox, that the very thing we hide the most is often the thing that connects us most deeply to others. Because when the final confession comes, when the voice trembles one last time before silence takes over, it won't be about sin or salvation. It will be about memory, about what we dared to speak and who stayed to listen. That's the quiet promise buried inside every confession. Not that we'll be forgiven, but that we'll be heard. And sometimes being heard is all the redemption we need. They say that every soul at some point feels the unbearable need to speak before it disappears. Maybe that's why, in the last moments of life, people suddenly start telling stories they have kept locked away for decades. Secrets that seem too dangerous to voice when time still stretched ahead suddenly demand release when the clock begins to fade. It's like the heart refuses to carry anything heavy across the threshold. Hospitals, nursing homes, and deathbeds all become unexpected confessionals, softly lit rooms where people try to make peace with ghosts only they can see. And it's almost poetic. After a lifetime of silence, the body finally does what the soul always wanted. To be honest, even if it's too late to change anything, there's something humbling about those final truths. They strip away the drama we spend our lives decorating ourselves with. No one on their deathbed ever says, "I wish I'd hidden better." What they say is, "I wish I'd said it sooner." That's the cruel comedy of existence. We spend decades protecting our image, and then, in the end, we beg to be known for real. Maybe that's why the dying talk to empty rooms, or whisper to people who aren't there. They're confessing to the air, just in case someone, human or divine, is still listening. And if you've ever sat with someone in that moment, you know it's not tragic. It's oddly peaceful. The fear goes first, then the ego, and what's left is something raw and strangely light. Throughout history, humans have built endless rituals around this same urge to release. In ancient Greece, dying people whispered their secrets to a coin before placing it in their mouths, an offering to Charon, the ferryman, so he could carry both their soul and their truth across the river. In some Native American tribes, the dying would confess to the fire, believing that flames carried their words to the ancestors. Even in modern times, doctors notice something similar. Patients who talk openly about regrets or confessions tend to die calmer, as if truth itself is a kind of morphine. It doesn't fix anything, but it makes the end bearable. And maybe that's because confession is less about morality and more about biology. Guilt, after all, is heavy chemistry. It sits in the body like unspent electricity. You can almost hear it buzzing beneath the ribs. When you speak the truth, you discharge it. Scientists studying emotional release found that confession literally lowers blood pressure and slows the heart rate. The body, it seems, has been waiting for the words, too. It's as if every cell sighs in relief, saying, "Finally, we can rest." That's what people mean when they talk about feeling lighter. It's not metaphor, it's physiology. Honesty is the body's natural medicine. Still, humans have a remarkable ability to complicate the simple. We turn the act of confession into performance, into strategy, even into content. "I just want to be transparent," someone says on social media, before confessing to the algorithm instead of a person. It's fascinating, isn't it? We've replaced priests with comment sections, seeking absolution through likes and sympathy emojis. The truth, once sacred, is now crowdsourced. And yet, even in this strange new world, the core remains. We speak because silence corrodes us. The medium changes, but the need stays ancient. Some of the most unforgettable confessions are the ones no one asked for, like the old man who calls his estranged daughter after 30 years and says, "I don't even remember why we stopped talking." Or the woman who admits she never loved her husband, but loved the idea of being loved. These are not cinematic lines. They're small, fragile moments of brutal honesty that never make it into movies because they're too real. And yet, they're the moments that change everything. It's astonishing how a few sentences can collapse decades of armor. That's the secret power of confession. It's both demolition and creation at once. Sometimes, though, confession doesn't come in words. It leaks out through behavior. The man who can't stop fixing things that aren't broken. The woman who keeps giving gifts no one asked for. The teenager who jokes too much about being fine. These are silent confessions, emotions translated into strange dialects of survival. You can hear them if you listen closely enough. Every habit, every fear, every joke hides a line from the unwritten confessional script. We're constantly telling on ourselves without realizing it. Maybe that's what truth really is, a persistent echo, even when we try to drown it out. And when confession finally happens, it rarely looks noble. It's messy, stuttering, and inconvenient. It shows up at family dinners and traffic jams, and drunken voicemails left at 2 a.m., no orchestra swells, no camera pans in for a close-up, just a trembling voice saying, "I need to tell you something." That's the real theater of humanity, unscripted, unfiltered, and deeply awkward. Yet within that awkwardness lies something divine. Because in that moment, you see the rawest version of a person, not their curated self, but their living, breathing truth. It's clumsy, it's beautiful, and it's the most honest language we speak. There's also a secret comedy in how people expect confession to solve everything instantly. "I told the truth," they say, waiting for their life to magically rearrange itself like a movie ending. But truth doesn't fix, it reveals. It doesn't close the story, it opens it wider. Sometimes confessing breaks what little stability you had left, but that's what growth looks like. Chaos with better lighting. The truth shatters before it heals, and most of us want the healing without the mess. But you can't repaint the walls without first seeing where they've cracked. Confession isn't renovation, it's demolition with purpose. Even so, there's humor in the whole thing. Humans are the only creatures who can feel guilty about what they might do. A cat doesn't stare into space thinking, "I really shouldn't have eaten that bird." But we invent sins ahead of time just to have something to confess later. Maybe that's our curse or our genius. We've turned morality into imagination. Every religion, every therapy session, every late-night talk is built around the same dance, imagining who we could be if we were finally brave enough to tell the truth. And occasionally we are. And for a fleeting moment, that bravery feels like flight. There's an ancient belief that the universe keeps no secrets, that every truth unspoken still vibrates somewhere in the air, waiting to be heard. Maybe that's why people talk to stars, to graves, to empty rooms. Maybe confession was never meant for the listener at all. Maybe it's the echo that matters. the sound of yourself admitting you exist. Because when all the rituals and religions fade, what remains is this simple, stubborn instinct to tell the truth before the silence takes it. And perhaps that's the final confession. Not about sin, not about guilt, but about love. To say, I was here, I felt everything, I made mistakes, but I tried. That's the only testimony that matters in the end. The church may offer absolution, therapy may offer understanding, but the soul asks for something simpler. To be remembered as honest, not perfect, just real. And if that's the last thing we manage before the lights go out, maybe that's redemption enough. Because in that final act of truth, whispered into the quiet, we return to the same place where it all began, with a voice, trembling but free, daring to speak into the dark. They say that truth is light, but most people only tell it when it's dark. There's something about shadows that makes honesty easier. Maybe that's why confessionals were built dimly lit, or why people pour their hearts out in cars at night with the engine idling. The darkness feels like a witness that won't gossip. And maybe that's the secret. Humans don't actually fear judgment. They fear exposure. That's why so many of us whisper our truths to the void instead of to each other. The void, at least, doesn't interrupt with advice. Still, it's fascinating how the smallest confession can rearrange an entire life. A single sentence, I wasn't happy, or it was my fault, can shake the foundation of years of pretending. It's not the words themselves that hold power, but the act of finally saying them. There's a strange strength in admitting weakness. The moment you confess, the story you've been running from stops chasing you. You turn around and realize it was only a mirror all along. That's why confession always feels both terrifying and tender. It's like turning on the lights in a messy room. You see everything you've been avoiding, but at least now you can clean it up. The funny thing is, we spend so much time hiding from people who would probably forgive us anyway. Families break over silence, friendships fade because no one dares to say, I was wrong. We act as if apologies are extinction-level events. Yet when they finally come, they rarely destroy anything. They rebuild. People are far more merciful than we imagine. It's just that our pride keeps rehearsing doomsday scenarios in our heads. It's ironic, really. We protect ourselves from rejection by rejecting honesty first. Then we sit there, miserable, wondering why no one understands us. Humanity might be the only species that lies for self-defense and still ends up wounded. There's a story about a prisoner who confessed to crimes he didn't commit, just to escape the torture of being disbelieved. The guards were so used to hearing lies that they couldn't recognize truth even when it screamed. Sometimes that's us with ourselves. We deny so long that when the truth finally surfaces, we interrogate it. Is this really how I feel? Am I sure this is what happened? We're our own guards, our own jailers, beating honesty back into silence because it's inconvenient. But truth has patience. It waits. It leaks through dreams, slips into conversations, and sits quietly in the gut until we can no longer swallow around it. Then, like a storm finally breaking, it spills, and what a relief it is to drown in clarity. Confession is funny like that. It always arrives late, usually after we've tried everything else. We promise ourselves we'll talk tomorrow, we'll write that message next week, we'll explain when the time is right. But the right time never comes. There's always another excuse, another layer of fear. Then one day, it just bursts out in the middle of dinner or during a walk or through tears you didn't plan. It's as if the soul has been holding its breath for years and suddenly gasps. And afterward, there's always that silence, awkward, heavy, holy. You can almost hear your old self crumbling inside it. Some cultures believe that confession cleans not just the soul, but the air around you. Tibetan monks once said that unspoken truths accumulate like dust on the spirit, making it heavier to move through the world. So they chant not only prayers, but their faults, believing sound can shake off spiritual debris. Modern life isn't so different. We call it venting, but it's the same act in disguise. People go to bars, therapists, podcasts, even group chats to cleanse themselves of emotional clutter. The sacred has simply migrated from temples to timelines. The ritual changed form, but the ache behind it never left. We still want to be clean, just in ways that don't require robes or incense. And yet, there's a quiet tragedy in how much we still censor our truth. Society tells us to be authentic, but not that authentic. To speak your truth, but only if it's marketable. Honesty has become a performance art. We curate our confessions, crop out the shame, and add filters until even our vulnerability looks photogenic. It's a kind of spiritual Photoshop. But beneath all that polish, something raw still hums. A longing to drop the act completely. To say, this is me, unedited, and not apologize for it. Maybe that's why people cry when they laugh too hard. The body doesn't know how else to handle that much honesty at once. Sometimes, though, confession doesn't look like words at all. It looks like forgiveness. There's a strange power in letting go of what someone never apologized for. It's an unspoken confession of your own. The admission that you can't carry their sins anymore. You can't rewrite their guilt, but you can stop renting it space inside you. And when you do, something extraordinary happens. You become lighter, not because the world changed, but because you stopped dragging someone else's shadow behind you. Forgiveness, in that sense, is confession in reverse. It's saying, I release you, when what you really mean is, I release myself. Of course, even the holiest truths can be inconvenient. History is full of people punished for telling it. Prophets, whistleblowers, lovers who spoke too soon. Confession is not always rewarded. It can cost your comfort, your reputation, even your safety. But the alternative, the slow rot of silence, is worse. There's a reason suppressed truth turns into sickness. People who spend years pretending eventually lose track of what's real. Their laughter becomes rehearsed. Their eyes dim like windows in abandoned houses. And then, one day, someone asks them how they're doing and they freeze, because they don't remember the answer. But here's the twist. Once you finally tell the truth, even if no one believes you, you can finally believe yourself again. That's the real absolution. You stop living in exile from your own story. You stop explaining, performing, shrinking. You walk differently, not proudly, but peacefully. Because confession, at its core, is the opposite of shame. It's not about exposing your flaws. It's about reclaiming your humanity. It says, I'm no longer afraid to be seen as I am. And once you've felt that kind of liberation, you start craving it in every part of your life. That's when you realize that confession isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Every truth spoken carves a path towards something new, something more honest. Maybe that's what heaven really is. Not a place beyond death, but a state of living without secrets. A kind of inner clarity where your heart and your words finally agree. In hell, perhaps it's just endless pretending, or the heavy silence of a soul that never dared to speak. Either way, the choice has always been ours, to keep carrying the weight or to finally put it down. And if we're lucky, before the lights go out, we'll choose to speak, even if our voice shakes, because the truth, once spoken, never really dies. It lingers, like a soft echo reminding the world that we were here and that we had the courage, however briefly, to tell the truth. They say time heals all wounds, but that's not really true. Time doesn't heal, it just covers. The real healing starts when the truth finally comes out from under the pile. Confession, in that sense, isn't about reliving the past. It's about clearing the space it's been renting inside you, and the rent is always overdue. What's strange is how we keep pretending we're fine even when our minds are bursting at the seams. We've turned I'm okay into a national anthem of denial. People say it like they're reciting a prayer, even though their eyes are begging for someone to call them out. It's funny and sad at the same time, like trying to hide a fire by fanning the smoke. You can see this pattern everywhere. In marriages, in friendships, in nations. A whole generation has been trained to smile while their throats burn. We live in a world where image has replaced intimacy, where people apologize with emojis and confess their heartbreak through memes. We say everything except what matters. And maybe that's the tragedy of our era. We know how to broadcast, but we've forgotten how to speak. The soul doesn't tweet, it whispers, and it waits for someone willing to listen past the noise, yet most of us scroll right past the truth because it doesn't have good lighting. What confession offers, even in its clumsiest form, is stillness, that pause between the last lie and the first honest breath. It's a quiet that feels almost sacred, like standing in a church after everyone's gone home. No choir, no ceremony, just echoes of what was once said. You can feel your pulse again, steady and real, and that's the moment you realize the truth was never the enemy. It was the silence that was killing you. It's ironic that we fear honesty when it's the only thing designed to set us free, like fearing air after nearly drowning. But freedom comes with its own discomfort. When you confess, you lose control of the narrative. The moment the words leave your mouth, they stop belonging to you. Someone else gets to decide what to do with them. That's terrifying. Yet, at the same time, it's what makes the act so brave. You're saying, here's the worst of me. Do what you will. It's like standing naked in front of someone and hoping they see a person, not a collection of mistakes. The irony is, most people respect that kind of courage more than they admit. We may fear honesty, but we're drawn to it like moths to a flame. Because even in its awkwardness, it feels real. And reality is addictive in a world full of filters. Of course, not all confessions are clean or noble. Sometimes they come out sideways, through anger, sarcasm, or laughter that lasts a little too long. People joke about their trauma like it's a punchline, as if making others laugh can trick the pain into leaving. I have commitment issues, they say with a smile that doesn't reach their eyes. It's a funny kind of self-protection, confessing through humor. And it works to a point, but the soul keeps score. Every joke hides an unpaid emotional bill, and eventually the collection agency of truth comes knocking. You can't outrun what you haven't acknowledged. The universe has an impeccable memory for the things we refuse to face. Sometimes the most powerful confessions aren't the dramatic ones shouted in tears. They're the quiet admissions said in passing. A father saying, I should have been there more. A friend whispering, I was jealous of you. Those words carry more weight than any sermon. They're small cracks in the armor, but they let the light in. The human heart isn't healed by grand gestures. It's healed by sincerity that shows up unannounced, trembling but honest. It's why we remember those moments years later, word for word, long after the rest has faded. They remind us that connection is built not on perfection, but on shared imperfection. The paradox of confession is that it makes you vulnerable, but that very vulnerability becomes your strength. The moment you admit your flaws, you stop being blackmail material. No one can use what you've already owned. Imagine how different the world would be if people stopped pretending and started confessing before being caught. Politicians would lose half their careers, but humanity might finally gain its dignity back. Maybe that's the hidden power in honesty. It disarms. It ends the war you've been fighting with yourself. It's hard to be at peace when your mind is both the battlefield and the soldier. You can even see it in nature. The earth confesses every spring. After months of silence, it bursts open, mud, bloom, color. It doesn't apologize for winter, it simply becomes alive again. Maybe that's what confession really is, the soul's way of returning to color after too long in gray. People think of confession as exposure, but it's actually renewal. It's what happens when you stop editing your story and start living it again. That's why even science calls it release. Because truth, once spoken, doesn't just escape, it expands. It fills the air around you with something lighter than fear. And if there's one constant across centuries of confession, from the candlelit booths of medieval Europe to the glowing phone screens of today, it's this. Everyone, in the end, just wants to be seen. Not admired, not forgiven, seen. The child who hides under the bed after breaking something. The adult who hides behind success after breaking someone. It's the same cry, just with fancier words. Look at me. I'm not perfect, but I'm here. That's why confession has always survived every era, every religion, every culture. It's humanity's oldest form of saying, don't forget me. The strange part is that, after all this, the world rarely judges as harshly as we expect. Most of the punishment we fear comes from within. The church may have invented sin, but shame is a homemade recipe we keep perfecting. We season it with memory, cook it over anxiety, and serve it cold every morning. And yet all it takes to stop the cycle is one act of courage. A sentence spoken aloud, a truth finally owned. Suddenly, what felt like a mountain becomes a story. You laugh through tears, realizing the monster was never real. It was just your reflection in the dark. And so it comes full circle. The secret that once felt like a burden becomes a bridge. You share it, and someone else whispers, me too. And in that moment, two people stop pretending. Maybe that's what redemption really is. Not a priest's blessing or a divine pardon, but the quiet joining of two flawed humans who decide to be honest together. Everything sacred begins there, not in perfection, but in confession. And if there's a heaven, perhaps it's not made of clouds and harps, but of stories finally told, of hearts finally light, and of the laughter that follows when the truth, at last, is free. There's something deeply human about believing that the truth can wait. We postpone it the way people postpone dentist appointments, knowing it'll hurt more later, but convincing ourselves that next week will be better. Yet truth, like toothache, has a terrible sense of patience. It lingers quietly until it starts knocking on your skull. And when it finally demands attention, it's rarely polite. It shows up at 3 a.m, disguised as insomnia, or halfway through a conversation, disguised as tears. We call it breakdown, but maybe it's just the soul clearing its throat. You can see it in the way people suddenly blurt out their secrets in the least appropriate places. Funerals, weddings, family dinners, moments that are supposed to be scripted, safe. Someone inevitably stands up trembling and says something that rearranges the air. It's never planned. The truth doesn't like invitations. It crashes the party. And while everyone around gasps or pretends to check their phone, a strange kind of peace washes over the one who spoke. Because even when truth costs you everything, silence costs more. It's the only currency that never stops charging interest. We like to think of confession as a single event, but it's more like maintenance. You can't just do it once and expect to stay clean forever. It's like emotional hygiene. Some people shower daily, others wait until life starts to smell funny. Both approaches work. Just one's a little harder on the nose. On the real challenge is learning to recognize when your soul needs a wash. That uneasy tightness in the chest, that's truth trying to stretch its legs. The lump in your throat, truth doing push-ups. Your body knows before your mind admits it. We are walking containers of unsent emails, and confession is simply the act of hitting send. What's beautiful and hilarious is how creative people get with avoidance. We build whole philosophies around not admitting things. Stoicism, for instance, started as a noble idea about control, but somewhere along the way it became a polite way to say I'm fine while internally combusting. The modern version is toxic positivity. People say everything happens for a reason, when what they really mean is, please don't start crying, I just vacuumed. But confession doesn't need to be dramatic. Sometimes it's as small as admitting, I'm tired of pretending. That single line can feel like unclenching a fist you didn't know you were making. And yet, for all our progress, we still treat emotional honesty as something suspicious. We've built a world that rewards performance and punishes sincerity. We applaud vulnerability in theory, but in practice, we scroll past it. Maybe that's why people confess online. It's safer to be authentic in front of strangers. There's a weird freedom in anonymity. Behind a screen, the risk of rejection feels diluted. You can say, I hate my life, and get 200 hearts and a comment saying, oh, same. It's comforting, but also sad. How connection has become a digital reflex instead of a human one. The modern priest wears Wi-Fi instead of robes. Still, there's no denying that speaking, even to the void, changes something inside you. The moment you put pain into words, it stops multiplying in silence. Language turns suffering into structure, chaos into rhythm. That's why people write journals or songs or poetry. It's the same ancient instinct wearing new clothes. A blank page doesn't interrupt. It doesn't correct your grammar. It just listens, endlessly. And sometimes that's all you need. Not advice, not absolution. Just a place for the truth to live outside your ribcage. The world feels a little bigger once you've emptied a corner of your soul into it. But truth is sneaky. Once you start telling it, it demands consistency. You can't just confess once and go back to pretending. The same honesty that freed you starts haunting you when you betray it. Well, that's why some people seem restless after a big revelation. They've outgrown their lies, but they're still wearing them. It's like trying to fit into old clothes after growing taller. Sooner or later, something rips. Growth always comes with discomfort, but the alternative is stagnation, and that's a slow kind of death. The kind you can live through for decades without noticing, until one day you realize you stopped laughing years ago. Of course, confession isn't always noble. Sometimes it's selfish, manipulative, even cruel. People say, I just needed to get it off my chest, as if unloading their guilt onto someone else is an act of generosity. Honesty without empathy is just emotional littering. You don't get cleaner by making someone else dirty. Real confession takes responsibility. It's not just about telling the truth, it's about holding it gently, owning it. The words, I'm sorry, are sacred because they acknowledge that truth isn't just what happened, but what it did to others. Without that awareness, confession is just noise disguised as virtue. There's a curious thing that happens after deep honesty. People either come closer or vanish completely. It's natural selection of the soul. Those who can stand in your truth without flinching become family, even if they're strangers. The rest fade away, not out of malice, but because your honesty holds up a mirror they're not ready to face. And that's okay. Confession isn't supposed to make you loved, it's supposed to make you real. Sometimes, becoming who you truly are means losing the audience who preferred your mask. The applause was nice, but breathing is better. Even nature understands this. Trees, for instance, drop their leaves every autumn without apology. They don't cling to the illusion of perpetual bloom. They shed what's dead to survive the winter. Confession is our version of that shedding. Messy, uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary. You can't carry last season's secrets into the new year and expect to bloom. There's something holy about decay when it's honest. The fallen leaves feed the soil that will nourish the next growth. The same goes for us. Our old stories, once spoken and released, become compost for whatever new truth we're growing toward. And that's why, even after all the centuries of trying to perfect it, confession remains imperfect. It's not neat or symmetrical or guaranteed to make sense. It's awkward, human, alive. It's a dance between pain and release, between fear and laughter. Because the moment after you tell the truth, when your heart is still racing, when silence hangs heavy and you wonder what happens next, that's the most sacred pause in existence. It's the universe holding its breath with you. And then, slowly, you exhale. The world doesn't end. The room doesn't collapse. Something inside you shifts, subtle but irreversible. You're lighter, not because the past disappeared, but because you finally stopped carrying it alone. And somehow, in that fragile, trembling freedom, you realize that confession was never about forgiveness. It was always about finally coming home to yourself. They say the truth will set you free, but they never warn you about the mess it makes first. No one tells you that freedom can look suspiciously like chaos. When you finally start telling the truth, really telling it, your life begins to rearrange itself in ways that are both terrifying and hilarious. People you thought would stay disappear, people you never expected to understand suddenly do, and you catch yourself standing in the middle of it, all thinking, wait, did honesty just redecorate my entire existence? The answer is yes. Truth is the world's most ruthless interior designer. It tears down walls, pulls up carpets, and leaves you staring at emotional floorboards you didn't know were there. What's beautiful, though, is that once the dust settles, you realize how much lighter the room feels. All those hidden compartments where you stuffed shame, guilt, and old stories empty. You can breathe again. But here's the paradox. The light that comes in after confession also makes you see the dust you never noticed before. That's the tricky part about being honest. It's not a one-time miracle. It's maintenance. Just when you think you've finished cleaning, life hands you another broom. And sometimes you have to laugh at how absurd it all is. We keep discovering new layers of ourselves like a never-ending emotional onion. Tears guaranteed, flavor questionable. It's in these moments of self-discovery that confession becomes less about morality and more about rhythm. It's a pulse, a steady beat that keeps you human. You fall, you speak, you rise, and then you fall again. It's not failure, it's music. You start realizing that being human isn't about getting it right, it's about staying honest through the mistakes. The ancient monks had a saying, confessio est respiratio animae. Confession is the breath of the soul. And maybe that's true. Because when you stop confessing, when you stop speaking your truth, your spirit starts holding its breath. And the longer you hold it, the more suffocating life becomes. Even the body seems to know. Ever notice how people physically change after telling a deep truth? Their shoulders drop, their voice softens, their eyes look less hunted. Scientists might call it the parasympathetic nervous system activating, but it feels more like the soul exhaling. It's proof that our emotions live in our muscles as much as in our minds. Every lie, every unspoken secret lodges itself somewhere, in the jaw, in the stomach, in the space behind your ribs. When you finally let it out, your body rejoices like someone opening a window after years of stale air. There's even a strange humor in it. We spend thousands on massages and yoga retreats when sometimes all we really needed was to tell someone the truth. But, of course, truth is contagious. Once you start living it, you can't help but spread it. People around you start feeling braver, too. It's like emotional herd immunity. Each confession weakens the virus of pretense. You might notice conversations getting deeper, laughter sounding realer, silence feeling less awkward. That's the thing about truth. It invites others to unclench. And while it's not always comfortable, it's strangely addictive. Suddenly, small talk feels unbearable. You crave the kind of exchanges that peel the skin off existence. You want to know what keeps people awake at night, what they're afraid to admit, what they'd confess if they thought the world would still love them afterward. Yet not everyone is ready for that kind of honesty, and that's okay. Some people need to keep their armor for a while longer. You learn to meet them where they are, without judgment, because confession teaches compassion in the most unexpected way. Once you've faced your own flaws head on, it becomes much harder to throw stones at others. You begin to recognize the quiet tremble in someone's voice when they're hiding something, and instead of condemning them, you just wait, patiently, gently, like someone who's been there. That's the subtle miracle of confession. It softens the edges of the world. There's also an odd kind of comedy in realizing how much energy we waste pretending. We rehearse fake versions of ourselves like actors in a never-ending play no one paid to see. We even applaud each other for it. Wow, you look great, we say to someone clearly falling apart. It's social theater, and everyone's tired of it. Deep down, we crave a standing ovation for simply being real, for saying, actually, I'm not okay, or I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm scared. Those lines don't win awards, but they connect hearts faster than any polished performance ever could. Honesty, in the end, is the only language everyone understands. Sometimes I think the universe is in on the joke. It keeps giving us opportunities to tell the truth disguised as disasters. A breakup, a failure, a loss. They all strip away the pretense and force us to confront what's underneath. You can call it cruel, or you can call it generous, depending on your mood. But it's almost as if life knows that without a little chaos, we'd never stop pretending everything's fine. Maybe that's why our greatest confessions often come right after our biggest collapses. When there's nothing left to lose, honesty finally feels safe. And yet, the most unexpected thing confession teaches you isn't about guilt or redemption. It's about love. Not the romantic kind that fills songs, but the quiet, steady kind that shows up when you've told the worst parts of yourself and someone still stays. That's real grace. It's when love says, I see you, and I'm not leaving. It's humbling, really. Because for all our talk about divine forgiveness, there's nothing more godlike than a human being who hears your truth and doesn't flinch. That kind of love rewires the soul. It teaches you to stay with yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. But love, too, demands confession. Every I love you is a confession. Every I'm sorry, a prayer. Every time we tell someone what they mean to us, we risk being misunderstood, but we do it anyway. Because not saying it feels worse. Silence kills more relationships than betrayal ever could. So we keep confessing, in big ways and small, hoping that somewhere between the vulnerability and the laughter, we'll stumble upon understanding. And when we do, it feels sacred, even if we don't call it that. At the end of it all, maybe that's what confession has been trying to teach us. Not just how to tell the truth, but how to live it. To stop performing and start participating. To understand that every secret spoken is a bridge, every apology a seed, every truth a form of rebirth. It's not about erasing the past, it's about giving it purpose. The stories we once hid become the stories that save someone else. And that's how the cycle continues. One trembling voice at a time, daring to speak in the dark, unaware that it's already bringing light. Because somewhere, someone is waiting to hear a truth that sounds like their own. And when they do, they'll breathe differently. That's how humanity survives. Not through perfection, but through shared confession. A symphony of trembling honesty echoing through the ages, reminding us that no one is ever truly alone in their mistakes. And if there's laughter along the way, and there always is, it's just the universe applauding, delighted that, once again, we've remembered how to be real. It's strange how easily humans forget that honesty isn't a virtue, it's survival. Somewhere along the way, we started treating truth like a luxury, something we could afford only when the timing was perfect, the lighting flattering, and the audience forgiving. But life doesn't wait for good lighting. Truth doesn't either. It shows up uninvited, usually while you're halfway through pretending to be fine. Maybe that's the great cosmic joke. We spend years rehearsing who we think we should be, only to realize everyone else is also improvising badly. We're all actors in a play with no script, confessing our lines by accident. What's remarkable is how truth has a sense of humor. It doesn't knock gently. It barges in wearing muddy shoes. It shows up during family dinners and therapy sessions and awkward car rides where no one's making eye contact. And every time it feels like a disaster, but later you realize it was the most honest thing that could have happened. Think about the last time someone told you the truth you didn't want to hear. You probably hated it. Maybe you even argued. But weeks later, there you were, quoting them to someone else, pretending it was your own realization. That's the thing about truth. It's like a seed. It irritates first, then roots itself quietly while you're busy defending your comfort. Confession has always been the human way of watering those seeds. We speak our truths, not because we're noble, but because silence eventually becomes unbearable. It's like trying to hold your breath forever. You can do it for a while, but sooner or later your body revolts. Words burst out of you, sometimes messy, sometimes broken, but always real. And isn't that what we're all chasing, deep down? Something real. That's why even the most polished people crack open after enough time. CEOs cry in airport bathrooms. Politicians confess to journalists they swore to avoid. Stoics write diaries full of doubts. Everyone has a pressure valve somewhere, even if they pretend they don't. There's something comical about how universal this is. We imagine our secrets make us unique, but really, they make us human. Everyone is carrying some version of the same burden. Guilt, regret, love unspoken, fear unhealed. The details change, but the melody's the same. We could probably solve half the world's conflicts if people just sat in a room and said, yeah, me too. Just detox. But we don't, because we're terrified of exposure. We build our lives like fortresses, piling bricks of pride until we forget what we were protecting in the first place. And then one day, someone knocks on the door, softly, kindly, and says, you can come out now. And it's terrifying, but it's also freedom. Sometimes confession happens not with words, but with presence. You know those moments when someone looks at you, really looks, and you feel seen in a way that burns and soothes at once? That's its own kind of truth. No explanation, no performance, just recognition. In those moments, you realize that all your carefully constructed defenses were never necessary. People aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for resonance. That's why art and storytelling work the way they do. A song, a film, a whispered story, they're all forms of collective confession. Someone dares to say what everyone else is too afraid to admit, and the world responds, finally. It's funny to think that the first recorded confessions were carved into stone. Ancient civilizations believed words had to be etched permanently to be taken seriously. Imagine that, the weight of your sins immortalized in rock. Today, we've gone in the opposite direction. We confess in comments, and texts, and voice notes that disappear in 24 hours. We treat our deepest feelings like disposable content. Maybe that's progress, or maybe it's cowardice disguised as convenience. But even in its digital form, the impulse is the same. We're still trying to unburden ourselves. We just do it faster now, with Wi-Fi instead of witnesses. Still, no matter how modern the world gets, the aftermath of truth remains timeless. There's always that silence after confession, the pause where the air seems to wait for permission to move again. It's the most honest kind of silence there is. You can feel the molecules rearranging themselves, making room for whatever comes next. Sometimes it's forgiveness, sometimes it's distance, but it's always transformation. Because confession doesn't guarantee reconciliation, it guarantees change. You don't walk away from truth unchanged. You either grow or you shed. Either way, you're not the same person you were 5 minutes before. And maybe that's what scares us most. Not the truth itself, but what it demands. Honesty has a way of stripping away everything that's unnecessary. The version of you that existed before can't survive the weight of revelation. But there's a strange relief in that too. It's like cleaning out an attic. You resist it for years, then one day you open the door and realize half the junk wasn't worth keeping anyway. The relief is almost embarrassing. You think, why did I wait so long to let this go? That's the quiet miracle of confession. It doesn't erase the past, but it makes peace with it. It teaches you how to live forward without tripping over your own history. Of course, some people never learn that lesson. They mistake repression for strength. They build their identities around being unshakable, unbothered, unreadable. They become monuments to stoicism, and monuments, by definition, don't move. They stand tall but lifeless, admired but untouched. Eventually, the cracks appear. And when they do, it's not shameful, it's divine. Because what's breaking isn't weakness, it's the illusion of invincibility. Every crack is an invitation for light to enter, and when it does, even the hardest hearts soften. That's why confession, for all its messiness, remains sacred. It's the one act that bridges heaven and humanity, where the soul stops pretending to be stone. It's almost ironic, isn't it? We fear confession because we think it makes us small, when in truth, it expands us. It's the act of saying, here's the worst of me, and realizing the world doesn't collapse. In fact, it opens. Someone nods, someone relates, someone forgives. The connection we crave doesn't come from perfection, but from shared imperfection. Maybe that's why we find peace in the strangest places, in late night talks, in apology letters, and awkward laughter after a painful admission. Because those are the moments when humanity feels less like a performance and more like a home. And maybe that's where it all leads, to the understanding that confession isn't about cleansing or punishment. It's about belonging. It's about standing in the naked truth of your existence and realizing you were never alone in it. Every person you've ever loved, every stranger you've ever passed, every ancestor who's ever whispered to the stars, they've all confessed in one way or another. Some through words, some through silence, some through the way they kept living despite everything. The great secret is that confession isn't a weakness, it's continuity. It's the thread that ties us to one another, across centuries, across failures, across the trembling hope that the truth, no matter how heavy, was always meant to be shared. They say the world is full of noise, but the truth is, most of it comes from the things we don't say. Unspoken words echo louder than thunder. They rattle around in our chests, bounce between our ribs, and keep us awake at night. People call it anxiety, guilt, nostalgia, whatever name feels less threatening. But it's really just silence trying to turn itself into sound. That's why, throughout history, humans have always found ways to confess, even when they weren't allowed to. If they couldn't say it out loud, they wrote it. If they couldn't write it, they painted it. And if they couldn't paint it, they buried it in rituals, hoping that maybe God or time would decode it later. It's like we've always known that truth once released keeps the world from rotting. You can see this everywhere. Ancient Egyptians wrote their wrongs on papyrus and buried them with the dead, believing confession could sweeten the afterlife. In Japan, people once whispered secrets into hollow bamboo stalks, sealing them afterward so the forest could hold their shame. And in Ireland, there's a legend that if you confess your sins to a stone and leave it by the sea, the waves will eventually wash them away. These weren't just myths, they were survival strategies. Humans understood something modern life keeps forgetting. The mind can't keep secrets forever. When it does, the body starts speaking instead. It develops mysterious pains, sleeplessness, fatigue. The body is always the last honest witness. That's the irony. Confession isn't about religion, it's about biology. Even your heartbeat speeds up when you lie. Your pupils dilate, your temperature rises. It's as if the body knows it's committing emotional fraud. Lying is exhausting because it requires constant maintenance, like running software that keeps glitching. That's why people who live truthfully look lighter, not because life is easier for them, but because they're not dragging a hard drive of secrets behind them. Honesty may not solve everything, but at least it doesn't require daily tech support. But truth has a sense of timing too. It never arrives when you plan for it. It slips in between conversations, appears in dreams, or reveals itself in the smallest, most ridiculous moments. You'll be brushing your teeth, minding your business, when suddenly your brain whispers, "You know that wasn't their fault, right?" Or you'll hear a song from 20 years ago, and without warning, it unlocks a memory you buried with surgical precision. That's confession, sneaking in through the side door. It doesn't need a priest, only a pause long enough to listen. Maybe that's why people fear silence. It's the sound of their own honesty waiting to speak. And yet, we keep pretending we're fine. We turn our emotions into stand-up comedy, turning heartbreak into punchlines because it feels safer to laugh than to bleed. You see it at every dinner table. Someone makes a joke about their failed marriage, and everyone laughs too loudly too long. Beneath that laughter, though, there's a pulse, a quiet plea for someone to say, "That must have hurt," but no one does, because we've mistaken humor for healing. We joke to survive, but sometimes we forget to stop joking long enough to actually live. Still, there's beauty in that too. Comedy is humanity's camouflage. It allows us to smuggle truth across the borders of fear. The more you pay attention, the more you realize confession is happening all around you, constantly, in plain sight. The friend who suddenly cancels every plan isn't avoiding you. They're confessing exhaustion without words. The stranger who looks away when you mention forgiveness is confessing regret. Even the person who brags too much is confessing insecurity in disguise. Every behavior is a kind of prayer, every silence a small admission. The world, when seen this way, becomes one giant confessional booth. Billions of souls whispering to each other through glances, gestures, and half-finished sentences. And then there's the most dangerous kind of confession, the one you make to yourself. That's the one people spend entire lifetimes avoiding. It's easy to confess to others. You can edit the story, frame it, rehearse it. But admitting truth to your own reflection? That's brutal, because the mirror doesn't care for excuses. It doesn't care about your reasons or your good intentions. It just reflects. And yet, if you can face that reflection long enough to say, "I did this," or "I want this," something profound happens. You stop being haunted by the person you were pretending to be. It's not self-destruction, it's self-return. That's why confession feels like both death and resurrection. It kills the illusion, but brings you back to life. Of course, there's a funny thing that happens once you start living honestly. You begin to notice how many people around you are allergic to truth. You'll say something raw, something that took you years to say, and someone will reply, "Wow, that's a bit heavy." And suddenly you feel like apologizing for being human. But don't. Truth isn't heavy, denial is. The only reason honesty feels like a burden is because most people are still wearing masks, and your realness reminds them how suffocating theirs are. Think of it as an allergy to oxygen. They'll get used to breathing eventually. Still, we can't judge too harshly. Everyone has a reason for hiding. People learned early that the truth could get them punished, laughed at, or left behind. Children grow up in households where silence is safer than honesty, and then we wonder why adults struggle to speak. It's generational training, centuries of don't cause trouble and keep your head down. But the soul has a long memory. It remembers every word you swallowed, every time you smiled when you wanted to scream, and one day it demands repayment. That's when confession comes, not as choice, but necessity. The truth doesn't seek revenge, it seeks release. Some people think confession is about closure, but maybe it's about opening instead. Every time you tell the truth, you make space for something new to grow. You can feel it. The air shifts, your shoulders relax, your chest expands. That's the body recognizing freedom even before the mind does. Maybe that's what forgiveness actually is, the physical sensation of space returning. The story doesn't vanish, but it stops choking you. You start breathing in rhythm with the world again, and suddenly, even ordinary things, rain, laughter, quiet mornings, feel holy. And perhaps that's where confession has been leading us all along, not toward perfection, but toward connection. Because in the end, the purpose of telling the truth isn't to erase guilt, it's to end isolation. Every secret we keep builds a wall. Every truth we tell plants a bridge. And when enough people start building bridges, something miraculous happens. The world softens. The noise quiets. For the first time, you realize that maybe heaven was never above us, but between us. It's in the moments we choose honesty over comfort, compassion over pride, laughter over fear. That's the sacred space confession creates. Not a booth in a church, but a heartbeat shared between two people brave enough to be real. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of truth the universe has been waiting to hear all along. They say everyone wants the truth until it actually shows up. Then we all start looking for the nearest exit. The truth is like an unexpected guest. It knocks politely at first, then kicks down the door when you pretend not to hear it. And once it's inside, it starts rearranging the furniture. Suddenly, all the things you thought were stable, your beliefs, your stories, even your excuses, don't fit where they used to. That's what makes confession such a strange, almost comical experience. It's not just the act of telling the truth, it's surviving what happens afterward, when the truth decides to move in and make itself comfortable. The funny part is how predictable we are about it. You can see the same sequence in almost everyone. First comes denial, the polite smile, the "no, I'm fine." Then justification. Well, anyone would have done the same thing. And finally, the grand confession. Okay, maybe it was my fault, but let me explain. It's practically a universal script. Even history follows it. Entire empires have collapsed because someone refused to admit a mistake. You'd think after thousands of years of wars, betrayals, and bad decisions, humanity would have learned that honesty is cheaper than disaster. But no, we're still trying to negotiate with the truth like it's a tax auditor. There's something beautifully tragic about that, though, because at its core, confession isn't about punishment. It's about relief. It's that moment when you finally drop the act and admit you're human. And once you do, life stops feeling like a courtroom and starts feeling like a classroom. Every mistake becomes a lesson. Every regret becomes a doorway. But most people are too scared to walk through, afraid of what they'll find on the other side. What they don't realize is that the other side isn't judgment, it's peace. The truth doesn't want to hurt you, it just wants to stop being buried alive. You can see this even in the smallest moments. Think of that awkward pause after someone says something brutally honest at dinner. Nobody knows whether to change the subject or clap. The air feels electric, uncomfortable, but also real. Because in that instant, something unspoken breaks open and everyone feels it. It's like oxygen rushing into a room that's been sealed too long. Of course, we panic. We pour more wine, we make a joke, we pretend it didn't happen. But for a brief second, the masks slipped, and everyone saw a glimpse of something authentic. That's the strange power of confession. It's contagious. One truth invites another. It's fascinating how this pattern repeats itself across generations. Our grandparents confessed in churches, our parents confessed to therapists, and we confess to the internet. The setting keeps changing, but the need stays the same. It's almost poetic, really. We've traded wooden booths for comment sections, but the prayer remains identical. Please, let someone understand me. The irony, of course, is that we now confess to strangers more easily than to the people who love us. There's safety in distance. A stranger can't hurt you with your own truth. But someone close, they might. And that risk, That trembling fear of rejection is what makes the act of honest confession still feel holy. What's curious is how confession never really ends once it starts. It has this ripple effect, like throwing a stone into water. You confess one thing, and suddenly other truths start surfacing, uninvited. It's as if your soul, excited to finally be listened to, can't shut up. Oh, you're talking now? Great. Here's another thing you forgot to mention. It's uncomfortable but necessary, because every buried truth is a weight, and the more you release, the lighter you become. It's not just emotional, it's physical. Studies have shown that people who regularly express guilt or regret in healthy ways actually sleep better, have lower blood pressure, and live longer. Apparently, honesty is the cheapest form of healthcare, but it's not all science and virtue. There's comedy in the chaos, too. Humans are hilariously bad at confessing gracefully. We blurt, we overshare, we cry at the wrong time. We text X's at 2 a.m. Confession rarely comes out polished. It tumbles out, half apology, half exorcism. And yet, those messy moments are often the most profound, because they remind us that authenticity isn't pretty. It's raw, unfiltered, alive. The truth doesn't wear makeup. It shows up with bed hair and puffy eyes, but at least it's real. And in a world obsessed with appearances, that kind of honesty feels almost rebellious. Even nature understands the rhythm of confession. Every season is a form of it. Autumn sheds, winter rests, spring renews, summer celebrates. The earth has been confessing its cycles for billions of years, never ashamed of its decay or rebirth. Maybe that's why we feel most at peace in nature. It's the only place that doesn't lie about what it is. A tree doesn't apologize for losing its leaves. The ocean doesn't hide its storms. They simply exist, truthfully, unapologetically. Imagine if we lived that way, allowing ourselves to change, to release, to start again without shame. Perhaps the most honest confession we could make is that we're not meant to stay the same. It's easy to romanticize confession, though, forgetting how painful it can be. Truth, when it finally comes out, doesn't always feel like freedom. It can feel like grief. Because to confess often means killing an illusion. And illusions, for all their falseness, are comforting. They keep us warm. Losing them feels like standing naked in the snow. But that nakedness is also where healing begins. Because you can't build anything real until you stop pretending. And maybe that's why confession has always been linked to redemption. Not because it erases the past, but because it clears the path ahead. The more you live, the more you realize confession is less about morality and more about memory. It's about remembering who you were before the world taught you to hide. That innocent version of you, the one who cried freely, laughed too loudly, loved without fear, is still in there waiting to be acknowledged. Every confession is a way of saying, I haven't forgotten you. And when you finally say it, when you reclaim that forgotten self, something beautiful happens. You stop needing forgiveness. You understand that the act of being truthful is forgiveness itself. And maybe that's the quiet revelation buried at the heart of all confession, that we were never confessing to the world or to priests or even to each other. We were confessing to time, to the brief, fragile moment we're given to be alive, to love, to make mistakes, and to try again. Every I'm sorry, every I did this, every I was wrong is a way of saying I was here, I mattered enough to speak. And in that realization, the fear fades, the shame softens. What's left is something surprisingly tender, a kind of grace, not bestowed by heaven, but born from the simple courage of being real. And when you reach that point, confession stops being a burden. It becomes a language, the first language we ever spoke, before words, before fear, when all we knew was the urge to tell the truth. They say confession cleanses the soul, but they never mention how dirty it makes the room. The truth, once spoken, doesn't just vanish. It lingers like perfume, or smoke, or both, depending on the nature of the secret. And everyone who hears it, even accidentally, becomes part of its ecosystem. That's what makes honesty such a complicated thing. It doesn't end with you. The moment you tell the truth, it starts moving through other people's lives, reshaping their thoughts, their memories, even their own lies. Maybe that's why most people prefer silence. It's less messy. But silence, ironically, is the loudest thing in the world when it's filled with what we're too afraid to say. There's a strange beauty in the moment right before a confession. That suspended breath, the second when everything still has the potential to remain unchanged, you can almost feel your heart debating with your mouth. Are we really doing this? It's a little bit like jumping into cold water. You know it's going to shock you, but staying dry isn't living either. People think confession is about courage, but maybe it's about curiosity. You just want to see what happens when you stop lying. That's the funny part. Truth often arrives not as a moral decision, but as an accident of exhaustion. You get tired of performing, tired of carrying the script. One day, you simply drop it mid-scene and start ad-libbing. The audience, your friends, your family, your reflection, doesn't always applaud. Honesty is not a guaranteed standing ovation. Sometimes it's awkward silence, sometimes it's tears, sometimes it's the soft sound of someone walking away. But in all cases, there's something profoundly human in that raw exposure. It's the moment when the mask slips and the person underneath finally get some air. The ancient Greeks had a word for that moment, aletheia, which meant not just truth, but unconcealment. It wasn't about discovering something new, it was about removing what was hiding it. That's what confession really is, the art of unveiling yourself, even if what's underneath still trembles. It's interesting how history keeps reinventing this ritual. Once it was whispered behind wooden screens and candlelit churches. Now it's broadcast through microphones and social media, dressed up as vulnerability content. The impulse is the same, the need to be seen without disguise, but the stage has changed. People confess online because it feels safer to be judged by strangers than by those who know your face. There's comfort in distance. A stranger's empathy feels clean, detached, without the heavy weight of consequence. But that's also the trap. The internet forgives quickly and forgets even faster. Real absolution, the kind that heals, requires the risk of proximity. It demands that you look someone in the eye and say, "This is me," knowing they might never look at you the same way again. Still, it's hard to blame anyone for choosing the easier version. The truth is addictive, but it's also radioactive. It glows and burns at the same time. People crave honesty, but often can't handle its heat. That's why most confessions come out sideways, disguised as stories, jokes, or hypotheticals. Imagine if someone did something really stupid, we say, smiling nervously. It's our way of checking the room before stepping into the fire. And yet, once someone else admits their own mess, it's like a dam breaks. Suddenly, everyone wants to talk. The air fills with the sound of people exhaling after years of holding it in. Honesty, once unleashed, becomes contagious. It spreads like relief. There's a certain comedy in how we treat truth like a wild animal. We lock it away, feed it scraps of half-truths, and then act surprised when it breaks loose. It just came out, we say, as if the words had a mind of their own. Maybe they do. Maybe confession is less about choosing to speak and more about finally being chosen by the truth to deliver it. You can see this in every great story. The villain revealing their weakness, the hero admitting their fear, the friend confessing love at the worst possible moment. The timing is never perfect, but maybe that's what makes it perfect. Truth doesn't wait for convenience. It arrives like weather, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and necessary. And when it does arrive, it changes the atmosphere around it. You can feel it. Rooms get quieter, people shift in their seats. The temperature of the conversation changes. Even the light feels different, sharper somehow. That's because truth isn't just emotional, it's physical. It rearranges space. It vibrates in the air like music. That's why we remember the moment someone told us the truth long after we've forgotten the words themselves. The body remembers honesty. It stores it in the same place it keeps laughter, fear, and love. It's why some confessions feel like punches and others like warm rain. But what we rarely talk about is what comes after. The stillness, the uncertain rebuilding. Once the truth is out, it doesn't automatically fix everything. Sometimes it breaks things that needed to be broken. Sometimes it hurts people who deserve to know. Sometimes it just sits there, quiet and heavy, waiting for everyone to adjust. That's the hardest part of confession, the aftermath. The moment when you realize that honesty doesn't guarantee redemption, only possibility. You're free now, but freedom doesn't always feel like joy. Sometimes it feels like standing barefoot in the ruins of your own pretending. And yet, ruins are not the end. They're the beginning of something truer. History proves that. Great cities have been built over ashes, not denial. Humanity's story is one long confession written in architecture, art, and blood. Every masterpiece, every revolution, every song of heartbreak is an admission. This is what we did. This is who we are. This is what it cost us. And through that collective vulnerability, we evolve. We find beauty not in perfection, but in persistence. Maybe that's the secret. Confession is not about being pure, it's about staying alive in the mess. What's fascinating is how, after a while, honesty becomes addictive in a different way. You start craving the simplicity of it. You stop flinching when you speak. You start trusting silence again because it's no longer filled with what you're avoiding. You begin to laugh at yourself more. Really laugh. Not the nervous kind. Because you finally understand that everyone's ridiculous. Everyone's trying. Everyone's lying a little less today than they did yesterday. And in that realization, compassion blooms. You look at others and see yourself reflected. Not the flawless version, but the one who's still learning how to tell the truth gracefully. Perhaps that's what confession was always meant to lead us toward. Not sainthood, not salvation, but empathy. To understand that the moment you reveal your darkness, someone else finds the courage to face theirs. That's the quiet miracle of honesty. It doesn't just heal the speaker, it heals the listener. One truth begets another, until the room feels lighter, until the world feels possible again. And maybe that's where the story of confession ends, or begins, depending on how you see it, with one person daring to speak and another daring to stay. In that shared stillness between words and forgiveness, humanity breathes. They say every confession is the beginning of something new, but no one ever tells you how uncomfortable new beginnings can be. They're rarely poetic. They usually start with something awkward, like a sigh that's too heavy, a silence that's too long, or an "I need to tell you something," that makes everyone at the table suddenly very interested in their coffee. But that's the nature of truth. It doesn't enter gracefully. It stumbles in like a drunk guest at a wedding, knocks something over, and then, miraculously, changes the whole mood of the room. And maybe that's the point. Honesty isn't meant to be elegant. It's meant to be alive. What's fascinating is how the truth doesn't just free you. It rewires you. Once you've told it, even once, you start noticing how allergic you've been to pretending. And the taste of fake becomes unbearable. The small lies that used to save you start to itch. It's like your soul develops a new diet, and suddenly deceit feels like fast food. It fills you up, but you feel sick afterward. The body, too, seems to recognize the change. You sleep differently. You breathe differently. Even your reflection looks more familiar, as if it's been waiting for you to show up this whole time. There's something almost cosmic about that. The way one act of honesty can restore harmony, not just in your mind, but in your body, in your space, in your rhythm. But balance doesn't come easily. After confession, there's always a strange quiet, the kind that feels both heavy and clean, like the air after a storm. You stand there, drenched in your own truth, wondering if you've done the right thing. And that's when doubt shows up, smug and punctual as always, whispering that maybe you should have kept your mouth shut. It reminds you of the comfort of secrecy, the safety of silence. But comfort and peace are not the same thing. Comfort numbs you. Peace wakes you. And peace, as most people learn, is expensive. It costs your illusions, your controls, your carefully curated image. It costs the version of you who never made mistakes. But it gives you something infinitely better. Authenticity. And you can't buy that anywhere. The paradox of confession is that it makes you more human just when you feel most exposed. You realize that your flaws, the ones you've tried so hard to hide, are the same ones that make you relatable. People recognize themselves in your mistakes. They start trusting you not because you're perfect, but because you're not. It's strange, isn't it? We spend years trying to impress each other when what really draws us together are the cracks. There's a kind of divine comedy in that. Imagine the universe watching us scramble to appear flawless, shaking its head like a patient parent thinking, they still don't get it. Broken things let the light through. You see it everywhere, this quiet craving for honesty. In the songs that make people cry. In the films where someone finally says, I forgive you. In late night conversations that start with small talk and end in confessions about childhood and fear. It's not the perfection that moves us, it's the vulnerability. That trembling voice that says, here's who I really am, even if you leave. Because that's the bravest thing anyone can do, to risk being seen. And in a world addicted to hiding, that kind of bravery feels revolutionary. Yet honesty can also be mischievous. It doesn't always behave the way we expect it to. Sometimes it liberates you, and sometimes it gets you fired. It can heal a friendship or end a marriage. It can save your soul or ruin your reputation. Truth doesn't take sides, it just exists, untamed and unapologetic. That's why wise people say to handle it gently, like fire. Too little, and you live in darkness. Too much, and you'll burn down your own house. The trick, maybe, is to learn when to speak and when to stay silent. Not out of fear, but out of love. Because not every truth needs an audience. Some truths are meant to be held quietly, like a small candle in the dark, lighting only your own way forward. There's something oddly funny about how we expect truth to make life easier. We imagine this cinematic moment where we tell it and everyone claps and our problems dissolve into a happy montage. But real life isn't a movie. It's more like an improvisation workshop run by the universe. You confess, and instead of applause, you get questions, reactions, or worse, nothing. The silence after honesty can feel brutal. But maybe that silence isn't rejection. Maybe it's digestion. The world takes time to process what's real, especially when it's been living on a diet of lies. And that brings us to the most fascinating part. Confession doesn't just change the person who speaks. It changes the people who listen. Something in them stirs. They begin to wonder what they've been hiding, what truths they've been swallowing. Your courage becomes a mirror. That's how revolutions start, not with noise, but with one quiet act of honesty that dares others to stop pretending. History is full of such moments, a letter, a speech, a whisper that broke centuries of silence. It's proof that confession is not weakness. It's an engine of change. Still, even the most honest person needs rest from all that truth-telling. You can't live in perpetual emotional nudity. You'd freeze. So we develop a rhythm, a dance between exposure and retreat. We tell the truth, then retreat into the safety of our small mysteries, and that's okay. The goal isn't to spill everything, it's to stop carrying what poisons you. The rest, the tiny private truths that live quietly in the corners of your heart, those are yours to keep. They're not secrets, they're sanctuaries. And maybe that's the balance we've been searching for all along, to be open enough to breathe, but private enough to remain whole. When you reach that point, confession stops feeling like an obligation and starts feeling like gratitude. You stop saying, I have to tell the truth, and start saying, I get to. Because every truth spoken aloud is a small resurrection, a part of you returning to life after years of burial. You start understanding that forgiveness isn't something given from above. It's something that grows from within. You don't wait for absolution anymore, you become it. And once you've tasted that kind of freedom, you begin to see honesty everywhere. In the way trees shed their leaves without shame, in the way the ocean admits its restlessness, in the way laughter bursts out of nowhere when you least expect it. The whole world, it seems, is confessing all the time. You just needed to join the conversation. And maybe that's where the journey ends, or perhaps begins again, with the realization that confession isn't about sin, guilt, or even redemption. It's about belonging. It's about choosing truth over performance, connection over perfection, breath over suffocation. It's about remembering that you are and always have been a story worth telling. And maybe, if you're lucky, your story will remind someone else to tell theirs. Because at the end of all our noise, our laughter, our tears, that's all confession really is. A bridge between hearts, fragile but strong enough to hold the weight of being human. They say time heals, but time has a terrible sense of humor. It doesn't actually fix things. It just waits until you think you're fine and then quietly brings the past back for coffee. Maybe that's why confession never really ends. It loops back like a stubborn melody you can't get out of your head. Just when you believe you've said everything, some forgotten truth taps your shoulder and whispers, "We're not done yet." And there you are again, face to face with yourself, realizing honesty isn't a destination but a practice, a kind of spiritual housekeeping that never truly ends. There's something funny about how we think the truth has a schedule. We imagine that after a certain number of apologies, reflections, or therapy sessions, we'll be fully healed, as if the soul were a smartphone app that eventually finishes updating. But life doesn't work like that. Healing doesn't send you a notification. Sometimes it looks like laughing at a memory that used to make you cry. Sometimes it's noticing that the guilt you carried for years suddenly feels lighter, like a jacket that no longer fits. And sometimes it's realizing you can tell your story without trembling anymore. That's when you understand confession isn't about cleaning wounds. It's about learning to live with the scars and still find them beautiful. The most fascinating part of this process is how humor sneaks in through the cracks. You start seeing the absurdity of being human. The things that once felt catastrophic begin to sound like bad sitcom plots. Remember when I thought hiding my emotions would make me mysterious? Turns out it just made me constipated with feelings. It's a ridiculous kind of wisdom, the kind that comes only after you've cried enough to earn the right to laugh. And in that laughter, something shifts. It's as if the truth finally learns to breathe alongside you instead of suffocating you. We tend to think confession belongs in serious spaces, churches, therapy rooms, late-night talks, drenched in existential dread. But sometimes it happens in the most ordinary moments. Standing in line for coffee, you suddenly realize you're not angry anymore. You smile at a stranger, and for a split second, you feel lighter than you've been in years. No speech, no ceremony, just quiet release. It's almost comical how healing hides in these small moments, sneaking into daily life like an uninvited guest who brings peace instead of chaos. You never know when the next piece of truth will arrive. It could be mid-conversation, mid-commute, or mid-laundry. Apparently, enlightenment has no respect for timing. And yet, as liberating as confession is, it's also disorienting. Once you strip away the lies, who are you without them? People build whole personalities around their pain. I'm the one who was betrayed. I'm the one who never got chosen. I'm the one who always forgives. Take away the title and suddenly there's silence. But that's the silence you've been avoiding. The one where you meet the self that existed before the hurt. It's uncomfortable at first, like meeting a stranger in your own house. But slowly, as you get reacquainted, you remember that you were never defined by the story. You were the storyteller all along. It's strange how the moment you stop pretending, people don't always cheer. Some grow uneasy around your honesty, like it's a contagious condition. They preferred the polished version of you, the one who smiled on cue. But truth has a gravitational pull. It draws in the right people and quietly releases the ones who can't handle it. It's a natural selection of the soul. You stop chasing those who only loved your mask, and the peace that follows is unlike anything you've ever known. That's when you realize confession doesn't just reveal who you are. It reveals who truly belongs beside you. Science, surprisingly, agrees with all of this. Researchers studying emotional suppression found that the brain treats withheld truth like physical stress. It floods your system with cortisol, the same hormone that spikes when you're in danger. In other words, your body thinks lying is a survival crisis. So when you finally tell the truth, your body relaxes because it no longer believes it's under attack. That's why people cry after confessing. It's not weakness, it's chemistry. You're literally detoxing from dishonesty. And the most beautiful part? Once you've experienced that relief, you never want to go back. The truth becomes addictive, but in the healthiest way possible. Still, the universe has a wicked sense of timing. It will keep testing your newfound honesty in the most inconvenient ways. You'll swear you've learned your lesson, only to be faced with a situation where lying would make life so much easier. And in that moment, you'll feel the old instinct rise. Pretend, hide, deflect. But something inside you stops you now because you remember the price of silence. You remember the sleepless nights, the tension in your jaw, the weight of words unsaid. So you tell the truth anyway, clumsy and imperfect, and though it shakes you, it doesn't break you. It's proof that courage doesn't get easier, it just becomes familiar. Every culture in history has had its version of confession, which tells you something about our species. Ancient Greeks whispered their sins into the sea, trusting the waves to carry them away. In some Native American traditions, confession was woven into song, transforming pain into melody. Even animals seem to have rituals of reconciliation. Primates make peace gestures after fights, elephants touch foreheads after separation. It's almost as if nature itself understands that expression, not suppression, is the path to survival. Maybe confession isn't a moral act at all, it's biological. The earth doesn't hoard its storms. Why should we? The irony, of course, is that once you start living truthfully, life doesn't suddenly become easier. It becomes more real. You begin to see the complexity in everything. People aren't just good or bad. They're frightened, hopeful, imperfect beings doing their best with limited light. You stop expecting others to confess perfectly because you realize no one does. Every apology, every attempt at truth is messy, but that's what makes it authentic. The goal isn't to be flawless, it's to be sincere. And in a world built on performance, sincerity is the rarest form of rebellion. Eventually, confession transforms from an event into a way of being. You start speaking with more care, listening with more empathy. You stop holding grudges because you understand how heavy they are. You even start forgiving yourself, not because you've earned it, but because carrying guilt forever is simply inefficient. There's even humor in that realization. You laugh at how seriously you used to take yourself, how you once believed the universe was keeping score. Turns out, it isn't. It's just waiting for you to tell the truth and get back to living. And maybe that's the quiet secret behind all of it, that confession isn't just about words, it's about alignment. It's when your inside world finally matches your outside one. When what you think, what you say, and what you do stop arguing with each other. In that alignment, peace appears. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the everyday kind that makes your coffee taste better and your mornings feel lighter. It's the peace of no longer running from yourself. The peace of realizing that the truth, far from being your enemy, was always your home. And once you find your way back, you start wondering why you ever left in the first place. They say the hardest person to be honest with is yourself, and that's probably true, because you know exactly where to hide the evidence. You can fool almost anyone else with a smile or a well-timed, "I'm fine," but your own conscience? It has backstage access. It's seen the rehearsals. It knows when you're improvising. That's why true confession, the kind that changes you, doesn't begin with words. It begins with the quiet admission that maybe, just maybe, you've been the unreliable narrator of your own story. And that realization hits differently. It's funny and tragic all at once, like discovering the plot twist in a movie halfway through. Wait, am I the problem? The irony is that everyone loves to believe they're the hero. We edit our memories like filmmakers, cutting scenes that don't make us look good, adding emotional music where we want sympathy, fading to black before anyone can fact-check our version. But the truth, that stubborn little editor, never stops sending notes. It keeps whispering, "That's not exactly how it happened, is it?" And sooner or later, you have to face the footage uncut. It's uncomfortable, of course. No one enjoys watching their own bloopers reel. But that's where the real growth happens. In those raw, shaky, poorly lit moments we'd rather delete. Because that's where we finally stop performing and start remembering. Confession, at its essence, is the art of unlearning performance. It's what happens when you stop auditioning for approval and start auditioning for peace. And let's be honest, most of us have been chasing applause for so long, we've forgotten what silence feels like. The applause is nice, sure, it validates the mask. But silence, that steady, awkward, unfiltered silence, that's where the truth starts to stretch its legs. It's in that quiet that you finally realize something profound. Peace isn't loud because it doesn't need to prove itself. The truth doesn't shout, it waits. Patiently, like a cat sitting on your chest at 3 a.m., refusing to move until you acknowledge it. What makes confession funny, if you have the stomach for irony, is that it almost always arrives late. You tell the truth only after the lie has done its damage, after you've rearranged your life to protect it. It's like finally reading the manual after the machine has exploded. But there's grace in that too, because maybe the mess was necessary. Maybe the chaos was the only way to get your attention. People rarely grow during peace and comfort. They grow in the wreckage. In that way, confession isn't the opposite of failure. It's failure's redemption arc. It's the moment you turn the debris into architecture and call it wisdom. The real trick, though, is learning to confess without turning it into self-punishment. We humans are experts at weaponizing guilt. We apologize, but then we apologize for apologizing. We treat remorse like a full-time job. But guilt was never meant to be a residence. It was meant to be a hallway. You pass through it on your way to accountability, not set up furniture there. Yet some people decorate their guilt like it's a studio apartment. Oh, this is where I replay every bad decision I've ever made. And over there is my what-if corner. The truth is, confession loses its power the moment it turns into self-cruelty. Honesty should liberate you, not lock you in a nicer cell. And then there's the comedy of how people respond to your truth. Tell them you've changed, and half of them will squint like they're trying to see the difference. Some will clap. Some will gossip. Some will just blink and go back to their phones. But that's okay. Confession isn't a performance for others. It's a private pact with yourself. You tell the truth not to be believed, but to stop lying. And once you understand that, their reactions stop mattering. You realize that the audience was never the problem. It was the script you were forcing yourself to read from. Even history seems to agree. Some of the greatest transformations began with a confession, personal, political, or spiritual. Martin Luther nailed his doubts to a church door. Galileo muttered, "And yet it moves," under his breath. Artists have confessed through paintings, writers through words, scientists through discovery. Humanity keeps evolving through its own admissions. Every "I was wrong" has pushed us forward more than 1,000 "I was right" ever could. It's as if the universe is built on the understanding that truth, though painful, is progressive. You can't evolve while pretending you've always been correct. That's not growth, that's PR. The fascinating thing is how truth always finds its way out, even when you try to suppress it. It leaks through the cracks, in dreams and habits, and often comments that sound too honest. It's like emotional gravity. You can resist it for a while, but it'll pull you back eventually. The harder you fight, the heavier it gets. And the moment you stop resisting, everything lightens. That's why people describe confession as a release. It's not poetic, it's physical. You're literally dropping the weight of maintenance, of pretending, of control. And yes, it's terrifying. But so is holding your breath forever. The absurd part is how we're all doing this at the same time, quietly, secretly, pretending we're not. The entire human race is walking around with invisible confession booths in their minds. Every person you pass on the street is carrying a sentence they've rehearsed but never said. You can almost hear it if you listen closely, the collective hum of unsaid truths vibrating beneath the noise of everyday life. And if you ever doubt how powerful honesty can be, remember this. Every time someone finally says out loud what others have only thought in silence, the world shifts a little. It's like someone opens a window in a crowded room, and everyone takes a deeper breath without knowing why. But confession isn't just about light, it's also about shadow. The truth isn't always noble or redemptive. Sometimes it's small, petty, uncomfortable. Sometimes it's the kind of honesty that doesn't make you proud, but makes you real. Like admitting you were jealous, or that you stayed angry because it gave you purpose, or that the person you claimed to love you mostly just needed. Those are the truths that hurt the most, because they're not cinematic, they're human. And yet, those are the truths that connect us the deepest. Because perfection inspires admiration, but vulnerability builds kinship. Eventually, you realize that confession, at its core, isn't about guilt, it's about clarity. It's about clearing the fog between you and the world so that you can see again. The funny part is, once the fog lifts, the world doesn't change much, but you do. The same problems still exist, but they no longer own you. The same mistakes remain, but they no longer define you. You start walking lighter, speaking simpler, loving cleaner, and that's when it hits you. Confession was never just about admitting the past. It was about reclaiming the present. Because in the end, the truth doesn't fix everything. It just makes everything honest. And honesty, though messy, is the only soil anything real can grow from. You can build an entire life on half-truths, but it will always feel like living in a house with faulty wiring. Functional, but one spark away from disaster. Confession rewires the system. It doesn't make the lights brighter. It makes them stable. And once you've lived in that steady light, even for a moment, you can't go back to flickering in the dark. You don't crave perfection anymore. You crave peace. And peace, as it turns out, sounds a lot like the truth spoken softly and finally believed. They say honesty is like medicine, bitter at first, but healing once you swallow it. What they forget to mention is that sometimes the dose feels lethal, because the truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door in and starts rearranging everything inside you. It doesn't ask for permission. It just moves in, unpacks, and points out all the mess you've been pretending not to see. But maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Maybe the truth was never meant to make you comfortable. It was meant to make you real. You notice it first, in small ways. You stop laughing at things that don't actually amuse you. You start saying no without composing an essay of excuses. You delete texts halfway through because you realize they're just emotional gymnastics meant to please people who stopped paying attention long ago. It's oddly liberating, and a little terrifying. Because once you start living honestly, you realize how much of your life was built on polite lies. The parties you didn't enjoy but attended anyway. The friendships that thrived only on shared complaints. The job you told yourself was temporary 6 years ago. Honesty shines a light so bright it can feel like exposure. But here's the secret. It's not exposing you, it's freeing you. The strange thing about truth is how heavy it feels before you speak it, and how light it becomes afterward. It's like carrying a secret that weighs 50 pounds, and discovering it only weighed that much because you refused to drop it. The moment you finally say it out loud, "I'm not happy," or "I need something different," or "I forgive you," you almost laugh at how simple it was. You start to realize that most of the pain wasn't in the truth itself, but in the resistance to it. Human beings are weird that way. We'll endure years of emotional limbo just to avoid 5 minutes of uncomfortable honesty. But once you begin to live that way, something incredible happens. Your relationships start changing shape. The ones that were built on pretense crumble, but the ones that were real, they deepen. Conversations become shorter but more meaningful. The silence between words feels less like tension and more like trust. You stop trying to read people's minds and you start listening instead. It's disarming at first, this level of sincerity. You expect people to run, but instead, they lean in. Because truth, when spoken with kindness, has a gravity of its own. It draws people who are tired of pretending, too. The funny part is that the more honest you become, the more ridiculous dishonesty looks. You start spotting it everywhere, on social media, in small talk, in the mirror. The world starts to feel like a stage play where everyone's forgotten their lines. Someone asks, "How are you?" And you both know they don't want the real answer. So you say, "I'm good," and they nod, relieved, and the performance continues. It's tragic and hilarious all at once. You catch yourself laughing at the absurdity of it, this giant global improv act where everyone's pretending to have it all figured out. But underneath that laughter is a quiet sadness, because you remember when you were still part of the cast. Honesty, though, has a strange side effect. It makes you humble. You realize how often you've been wrong, how many times you've projected, misunderstood, overreacted. You begin to see yourself not as a villain or a victim, but as a beautifully flawed participant in a very messy play. It's humbling and oddly comforting, because if everyone's stumbling through life, then maybe we can stop competing over who hides it best. Maybe we can finally stop demanding perfection from each other. There's something sacred about that moment when you stop trying to win and start trying to understand. You also start noticing how silence changes meaning. Before, silence was uncomfortable, something to fill with chatter or noise. Now it feels like truth's most elegant companion. You sit with it more. You stop rushing to fix, defend, or explain. You learn that not every truth needs to be spoken immediately. Some truths need time to mature. There's a wisdom in restraint, just as there is in honesty. Because telling the truth isn't about blurting everything that crosses your mind. It's about aligning your words with your integrity. It's about speaking when your voice can build, not just break. Sometimes that means walking away quietly instead of making a grand announcement. Sometimes it means forgiving without a confession or loving without a label. The most powerful truths are often the quietest ones, the ones that reshape you from the inside out. Like when you realize that closure doesn't come from others, it comes from acceptance. Or that peace isn't something you find, it's something you stop disturbing. These aren't the kinds of truths you proclaim, they're the kind you live. And yet, there's still humor in all this seriousness, because the more you evolve, the more the universe seems to test you in absurd ways. The day after you vow to always tell the truth, someone asks, "Do you like my haircut?" And suddenly, you're standing there, wrestling with your principles and your survival instincts. It's in those moments that honesty becomes less about purity and more about grace. Maybe it's okay to tell a small lie if it saves a heart. Maybe kindness is the highest form of truth. Maybe the goal isn't brutal honesty, but compassionate authenticity. The kind that doesn't use truth as a weapon, but as a bridge. You start to notice that honesty and humor are siblings. They both thrive on surprise, on seeing through illusions. Every joke, after all, is just truth wearing a funny hat. That's why laughter feels so cleansing. It's a spontaneous confession of recognition. When you laugh, you're admitting, "That's me, I've done that. I know that feeling." Comedy is just honesty that learned to dance instead of cry. And maybe that's why the wisest people always seem a little funny. They've suffered enough to stop taking themselves too seriously. Somewhere in this process, confession becomes less about what you say and more about how you live. You stop compartmentalizing honesty into moments of drama and start making it the default setting of your life. You tell the truth, not because it's moral, but because it's easier. Pretending starts to feel like wearing a sweater 2 sizes too small. You can't breathe, so you live lighter, you speak simpler, you love without keeping score, and life, for all its chaos, starts to feel oddly manageable. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. And that's where it all circles back, to the realization that truth was never about punishment or virtue. It was about connection. Every confession, every awkward conversation, every honest laugh is just an attempt to bridge the distance between you and someone else. To say, "I see you," and "Please, see me too." Because underneath all our words, that's what we've been trying to confess all along. That we want to be understood, that we want to be known. And maybe, after everything, that's what confession truly means. Not the spilling of secrets, but the courage to be fully seen and still stay. There's a moment, somewhere between the first lie and the final confession, when you realize that honesty isn't just about telling the truth. It's about surviving it. Because the truth doesn't always arrive with clarity or closure. Sometimes it shows up like a thunderstorm, messy, loud, and inconvenient. It ruins your plans, it soaks your pride, and yet somehow leaves the air cleaner afterward. You can almost smell the difference in yourself when it's over. The world looks the same, but something inside has shifted. The weight you've been dragging suddenly feels lighter, and it's both liberating and terrifying. Because now there's no illusion left to hide behind. It's strange how confession works like weather. You can sense when it's coming. The tension builds, the silence thickens, your chest tightens like the sky before rain. You tell yourself it'll pass, that you can keep it together, but deep down you know. Truth has its own forecast, and once it starts forming, there's nothing you can do but wait for the downpour. Some people try to outrun it, escaping into distractions, relationships, careers, anything that keeps them dry. But life has an interesting way of circling back with a storm bigger than before. You can't cheat the climate of your conscience forever. Eventually, you have to get wet. And when you finally do, when you let the truth soak through your layers, you start laughing, because it's both absurd and inevitable. How much time did you spend resisting something that was going to happen anyway? We humans love to act like we're in control, but confession proves we never were. The truth always has the final say. It's like gravity. You can pretend it doesn't exist, but the fall will remind you. What's funny, though, is how the fall usually feels like flying at first. You think you're breaking apart, but really, you're breaking open. There's something beautiful about that unraveling. You start noticing all the small, ridiculous details of being human, like how people apologize by baking things, or how they say "I'm fine" in the exact same tone used for "I'm dying, or how we lie about tiny harmless things, like saying "I'm on my way" when we're still in the shower, just to protect our image as competent adults. We do it without thinking, like scratching an itch. But once you start living more honestly, you catch yourself mid-lie and laugh. You realize the world won't collapse if you admit you're late or wrong or lost. It's oddly freeing to say, "I messed up," and not follow it with a PowerPoint presentation of excuses. It's in that simplicity that confession transforms from a heavy act into a habit of clarity. You stop dramatizing it. You stop seeing it as a courtroom and start seeing it as a conversation. The guilt fades, replaced by curiosity. You begin asking yourself, not "what did I do wrong?" but "what was I trying to protect?" The answer is almost always the same: your idea of yourself, that fragile, overworked image you keep editing for public consumption. But when you finally stop protecting it, when you let people see the rough draft version of you, something miraculous happens. They love you anyway, sometimes even more. Because, as it turns out, no one ever bonded over perfection. The irony, of course, is that we spend half our lives pretending to be perfect in front of people who are pretending to be perfect too. It's like a masquerade ball where everyone's masks are slightly crooked and everyone's too polite to mention it. You start realizing that the moments you feel closest to others are never during the flawless performances. It's during the slip-ups, the stumbles, the accidental honesty, like when someone admits they talk to themselves in the car, or that they rehearse arguments they'll never actually have. That's when connection happens, not because of shared virtue, but because of shared weirdness. Honesty doesn't make you holy, it makes you human. There's a story I once heard about a man who built his whole life around hiding one mistake. He became rich, respected, admired, but as he grew older, the secret started to eat away at him, not from guilt, but from loneliness. Because when you hide the truth, you also hide yourself, and you build walls so high that even love can't climb them. One day, he finally told the truth, expecting chaos, and chaos came, but so did relief. People were shocked, then silent, then strangely kind. They didn't destroy him. They understood him. It was almost disappointing how anticlimactic honesty turned out to be. That's the irony. The catastrophe we fear is almost never as bad as the one we create by hiding. Once you realize that, the world opens up in the smallest, most surprising ways. You start listening differently. You hear the tremble in someone's voice when they say they're okay, and you know what that really means. You stop asking surface questions and start asking better ones. Not, "How was your day?" but "Where did it hurt today?" Not "What's new?" but "What's true?" These small acts of curiosity become their own form of confession, an invitation for others to lay down their burdens too. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world becomes gentler because you've stopped demanding masks from it. It's funny how this kind of truth-telling turns you into both a student and a teacher. You start noticing lessons everywhere. Nature, for instance, has no interest in pretense. Trees don't hide their scars. They wear them like history. The moon doesn't apologize for its phases. Even rivers confess. They move forward by letting go. Maybe that's why honesty feels so natural once you stop resisting it. The whole world has been doing it forever. It's only us who complicate it with ego and fear. But here's the real secret. Confession doesn't end with words. It ends with laughter. That moment when you've told the truth, survived the fallout, and can finally laugh at how dramatic you were about it. You laugh at your younger self, clutching secrets like they were gold, when really they were anchors. You laugh because you realize the thing you were terrified of, the judgment, the loss, the rejection, was never as powerful as the relief that followed. And that laughter, that lightness, is the sound of your soul stretching. Eventually, confession becomes less about what you admit and more about what you allow. You allow yourself to change. You allow others to see you mid-transformation. You stop trying to control how you're perceived and start focusing on how you feel. And as you do, something subtle and sacred happens. Life stops being a performance and starts being participation. You're no longer the actor holding a script. You're the story unfolding in real time. And maybe that's the truest confession of all. Not a list of sins or secrets, but a whispered admission. I'm still becoming. It's not shameful, it's holy. Because every time you say it, you're giving yourself permission to evolve. You're confessing to the constant miracle of imperfection. You're saying, I'm not done yet, and realizing that no one ever is. And somehow, that makes it all okay. Because if truth is the storm, then becoming is the rainbow, and both, in their own wild way, are part of the same beautiful confession of being alive. They say the truth sets you free, but they never mention how expensive freedom can be. It costs comfort, illusions, and sometimes even people. Because the moment you decide to live honestly, you start realizing how much of your world was built on agreements that required your silence. The friendships that thrived only because you never spoke your mind. The family traditions you upheld even though they suffocated you. The roles you played so well that you forgot they were roles at all. Telling the truth doesn't just rearrange your story, it rewrites the script entirely. And not everyone wants to keep acting in the new version. What makes it even more ironic is that truth doesn't arrive like a flash of light. It sneaks in like a leak. It starts as a small drip, an uneasy feeling, a restless thought, a sentence you almost say but swallow instead. Then one day, the ceiling caves in. You're drenched in realization, and suddenly you can't unsee what you've seen. There's no going back to pretending. You can repaint the walls, light a few candles, but the damage is there. And the craziest part? You'll thank it later. Because the leak, the collapse, the mess, it's the beginning of clarity. It's life's way of saying you've outgrown your own lies. At first, honesty feels like chaos. You speak and people flinch. You stop sugarcoating and they accuse you of bitterness. You begin to draw boundaries and are told you've changed. And you have, but not in the way they think. You've simply stopped performing for the approval of people who mistake exhaustion for kindness. You've realized that peace doesn't come from being agreeable, it comes from being authentic. Still, you can't help but laugh at how scandalous honesty is in a world obsessed with politeness. We applaud courage in theory, but when it walks into the room, we look for the exit. Yet, somewhere in the discomfort, something soft begins to grow. It's that strange, awkward tenderness that comes from seeing yourself clearly for the first time. You stop needing to defend every flaw. You stop rehearsing who you think you should be. You start saying, yes, I did that, or no, I don't feel that way, without your stomach turning into a knot. It's disarming how simple it becomes once you stop editing your existence. It's like learning to breathe again. After years of holding your breath for photos, suddenly life feels less like a performance and more like a conversation. You start noticing the truth in others too, the small, unguarded moments when people accidentally reveal who they are. The nervous laugh when they talk about their childhood. The silence before they say, I'm fine. The way someone's eyes flicker when they're pretending not to care. It's oddly beautiful, that shared imperfection. We spend so much time trying to hide our cracks, not realizing they're what make us glow. There's an old Japanese art called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, making the cracks the most valuable part. That's what confession does. It turns the fracture into something luminous. And the more you live this way, the funnier life gets. You start catching the absurdity of it all, the way people chase authenticity while still using filters, or how we build safe spaces that no one dares to be honest in. You laugh at yourself, too. You remember all the times you lied to avoid embarrassment and ended up creating bigger ones, like pretending you knew what AI algorithm meant in a meeting, only to be asked to explain it. Honesty, it turns out, is far less humiliating than pretending, and laughter becomes your favorite form of confession. It's the body's way of saying, yes, I was ridiculous, but I survived. Sometimes honesty doesn't sound poetic at all. Sometimes it's awkward, blunt, even clumsy. You trip over your own truth and land flat on your ego. You'll apologize, rephrase, second guess, but it's okay. The truth doesn't need choreography, it just needs presence. You learn that saying the right thing is less important than saying the real thing. Even silence, when honest, carries more weight than 1,000 perfect words. Because people don't remember your Polish. They remember your sincerity, the way your voice shook, the way you looked relieved when you finally said it. That trembling is what makes truth human. But confession isn't just about words, it's about action. It's how you live afterward. You can't tell the truth and still behave like a lie. You start aligning your choices with your words. You leave rooms that drain you, even if you built them yourself. You stop forcing connections that no longer fit. It's not cruelty, it's coherence. You can't carry your freedom and your facade at the same time. And while that honesty might cost you comfort, it pays back in calm. There's a strange peace in not having to remember your own fiction. You start sleeping better, laughing more easily, crying without apology. You become, in every sense, lighter. Still, truth has its own mischievous humor. Just when you think you've mastered honesty, life throws you a curveball. Someone asks, do you miss them? And suddenly, your throat tightens. You realize that telling the truth doesn't make you immune to it. It just keeps you awake for it. Honesty doesn't eliminate pain. It refines it. It strips it of confusion, leaving behind something cleaner, quieter, easier to live with. You can't escape heartbreak, but you can face it without the disguise. You can sit in the ruins and know that at least this time it's real. And maybe that's the whole point. The more you practice honesty, the more you understand that confession was never about guilt. It was about connection. Every truth you speak, no matter how small, is an invitation. This is who I am. Do you see me? And when someone answers with their own truth, something sacred happens. The distance between souls shortens. Two people stop pretending long enough to meet. That's the quiet miracle of confession. It doesn't just clean your soul, it expands it. You begin to realize that honesty isn't an act of bravery. It's an act of belonging. It's how you tell the world, I'm not here to impress you, I'm here to exist with you. And that realization changes everything. The fear fades, the masks drop, you stop trying to be extraordinary and start being sincere, because in the end, that's what everyone's really searching for. Not perfection, not admiration, but the simple relief of being understood. And maybe that's where the confession ends, or begins again, with the most liberating truth of all, that being human was never about getting it right. It was about showing up honestly, messy, and miraculous over and over again. The truth doesn't demand purity, it just asks for presence. To look at the world, at yourself, and say, this is me, still learning, still confessing, still alive. They say honesty is like fire. It can warm you or burn you, depending on how close you stand. And yet, most people spend their lives either running from it or trying to control it, as if truth were some wild animal that needs taming. But here's the secret. Truth doesn't want to be tamed. It wants to be understood. The problem is, we often confuse honesty with brutality, thinking that to be truthful means to be cruel. But real honesty isn't sharp, it's steady. It's not the fire that scorches, it's the one that keeps you alive through the night. You start realizing this the moment you stop using truth as a weapon. There's a difference between, I need to tell you the truth, and I need to tell you the truth so you'll hurt as much as I did. The first builds bridges, the second burns them. Yet, it's so tempting to choose the second, isn't it? Because pain wants company. When we've been lied to, the first instinct is to throw our truth like a grenade. We forget that the goal isn't to win, it's to be free. Freedom, after all, doesn't come from proving someone else wrong. It comes from no longer needing to. It's strange how we keep expecting truth to make people like us. We imagine confession as this cinematic moment where everyone claps, hugs us, and says, wow, you're so brave. But more often than not, truth is met with confusion, silence, or mild discomfort. People don't always want your honesty. They want your agreement. They want you to help maintain the illusion they've built. When you don't, it unsettles them. And that's okay. You can't be honest and universally liked at the same time. You can either be understood or adored, but rarely both. And once you accept that, something shifts. You start living differently. You begin choosing peace over popularity, clarity over comfort. You stop trying to convince people to understand you, because you realize that understanding isn't the same as approval. Some will still walk away when you speak the truth. But now you see that as a blessing, not a loss. Because anyone who leaves when you're honest was only loyal to your mask. The real ones stay, even when your honesty is inconvenient. The funny thing about truth is that it doesn't always come dressed as wisdom. Sometimes it arrives wearing embarrassment, wearing shame, wearing the memory of something you swore you'd never admit. Like when you finally tell someone, I was jealous, or I was scared, or I didn't know what I was doing. It's humbling, yes, but it's also strangely funny. Because once you say it, you realize how much power the silence had over you. We hold on to secrets like they're ancient curses, but once spoken, they often sound, well, kind of stupid. That's the miracle of confession. It turns tragedy into comedy, fear into humanity. It's almost as if the universe designed truth to keep us humble. The moment we start believing we figured it all out, life throws a situation at us that completely exposes our hypocrisy. You promise yourself never to judge someone, then find yourself judging them in record time. You swear you've mastered patience, then lose your mind in traffic after 30 seconds. Life is generous that way. It gives us endless opportunities to confess, laugh, and try again. Maybe that's what grace really is. Not perfection, but permission to keep learning out loud. You notice, too, how honesty doesn't just clean your soul, it cleans your perception. It strips away the fog you didn't even know was there. The world starts looking different, not because it changed, but because you stopped filtering it through fear. You begin hearing what people actually mean instead of what you want to believe. You start trusting your instincts more, not because they're infallible, but because they're finally uncorrupted by pretense. It's like your internal compass finally recalibrates after years of magnetic interference. And it's liberating in a quietly revolutionary way. Of course, living truthfully comes with its fair share of comedy. You'll find yourself blurting out honest thoughts at the worst possible moments. Like saying, I hate small talk right in the middle of small talk. Or accidentally admitting you don't understand a topic after nodding through an entire conversation pretending you did. These are the small prices of authenticity, mild social chaos in exchange for deep peace. And you know what? It's worth it, because once you get used to being honest, pretending feels exhausting. Even history has a sense of humor about confession. Some of the most transformative truths came from mistakes. Penicillin was discovered because Alexander Fleming forgot to clean his lab. Newton found gravity after being hit by an apple. A cosmic joke, really. Every great breakthrough begins with an oops. Maybe confession works the same way. Maybe it's just humanity saying oops on a spiritual level. Oops, I pretended too long. Oops, I hurt someone. Oops, I forgot who I was. And from that humility, evolution begins. But perhaps the most profound realization is that confession is less about what you admit to others and more about what you allow yourself to hear. Because before you can speak the truth, you have to face it in silence first. You have to sit in that uncomfortable stillness and admit things you can't post online. The truths that don't sound wise or noble, the ones that are messy, small, and deeply human. Like, I still miss them, or I was wrong, or I'm scared of being ordinary. These quiet confessions don't make headlines, but they make peace. Eventually, honesty becomes less of an act and more of an atmosphere. You stop thinking of confession as an event and start living as someone who doesn't need to hide. The need to impress fades, the pressure to perform dissolves. You find yourself laughing more, forgiving faster, and caring less about how you're perceived. Because truth, once fully embraced, stops being heavy. It becomes air. And when you finally breathe it in, when you start living without pretending, something incredible happens. Life itself starts confessing back. People open up around you. Strangers tell you their stories. Even the world feels softer, as if it's relieved you stopped pretending too. And maybe that's where all this has been leading. Not to some grand revelation, but to a quieter one. That confession isn't about sin or shame. It's about connection. It's the way the soul keeps itself honest in a world built on performance. It's how we remind ourselves that imperfection isn't failure. It's evidence of trying. And perhaps the ultimate confession, the one beneath all others, is this. We're all just doing our best, fumbling toward sincerity. Learning to love the truth as it is, not as we wish it to be. Because in the end, that's what makes us whole. Not perfection, not certainty. But the courage to look at the mess, laugh a little and say, there, that's me. Still learning. Still human. Still here. There's a strange moment that happens after you've told the truth. When the dust settles, the words have left your mouth, and silence fills the air like smoke. For a split second, your brain panics. It whispers, you shouldn't have said that. Because confession, even in its purest form, feels like walking out into the cold without a coat. But then something miraculous happens. Nothing explodes. The world keeps spinning. The people you feared might judge you, either don't or they do, and you realize their opinion weighs less than your own relief. That's when it clicks. Truth doesn't destroy you, it detoxifies you. It's funny how we grow up fearing exposure, like honesty is a form of social nudity. You can almost hear your childhood echoing, don't tell anyone, keep it quiet, smile. And so we learn to curate ourselves like museum exhibits, polished, labeled, and slightly dishonest. But eventually, you'd reach an age where the performance becomes exhausting. You start craving the messy kind of peace that only comes from saying what you actually mean. The irony, of course, is that everyone around you is craving it too, but everyone's too scared to go first. The moment someone does, though, it's contagious. You admit one truth, and suddenly others begin to unbutton theirs. That's the thing about confession. It's not linear, it's viral. One act of honesty gives permission for a dozen others. You've seen it happen in the smallest ways. Someone at dinner admits they're struggling, and suddenly the conversation shifts from weather and work to something that actually matters. Or when a friend says, I don't know what I'm doing with my life, and you feel your own facade crumble because finally someone said it out loud. It's both terrifying and comforting to realize that most people are improvising their way through existence. The world runs not on certainty, but on collective guesswork. Once you start living more openly, you realize how absurdly complicated we've made simplicity. We tell white lies to avoid awkwardness, half-truths to avoid vulnerability, and full-blown performances to maintain appearances. But what if awkwardness is exactly what honesty requires? Think about it. Every meaningful human moment has at least a trace of discomfort in it. The first, I love you. The first apology. The first time you tell someone who you really are. Those moments are sweaty, unpolished, and real. The exact opposite of what we call social grace. Maybe awkwardness isn't failure. Maybe it's the sound of authenticity breaking through. You start to see this pattern everywhere. In relationships, in faith, in art, even in science. Every breakthrough, every transformation begins with a moment of confession. I don't know. I was wrong. I need help. They're all forms of surrender. Little deaths of the ego that make room for evolution. Galileo confessed that the earth wasn't the center of the universe. Freud confessed that the human mind is more chaotic than we'd like to admit. Every truth teller, from prophets to poets, has had to risk ridicule to speak the uncomfortable obvious. So maybe confession isn't just personal, It's how humanity grows up. The humor in all this is that we treat truth like a fragile antique when it's really more like gravity. You don't have to believe in it for it to work. It doesn't disappear just because you avoid it. And when you finally stop resisting it, life gets easier, not simpler, just lighter. The kind of lightness that comes from no longer carrying the burden of pretending. It's wild how much energy we spend maintaining lies. If deception burned calories, we'd all be marathon runners by now. But the moment you stop, when you drop the performance, it's like your mind exhales for the first time in years. The real surprise, though, is that confession doesn't make you weak. It makes you magnetic. People start gravitating toward your honesty because it's rare. You become the kind of person others feel safe around, not because you're flawless, but because you're human. There's a gravity and authenticity that no charisma can fake. It's the quiet kind of strength, the one that doesn't shout or pose, but simply is. You'll notice people lower their guard around you, telling you things they haven't told anyone else. And in those moments, you realize confession is never just about you. It's a gift you give to others, the chance to be real in return. But here's the paradox. The deeper you go into truth, the less dramatic it becomes. The confessions that once felt earth-shattering eventually shrink into simple facts. Yes, I failed. Yes, I'm healing. Yes, I care. That's it. No grand declarations, no cinematic monologues, just quiet ownership. That's when you know you've grown, when the truth stops needing an audience, when you stop confessing to shock or impress and start doing it to align. Alignment is underrated. It's not glamorous, but it's the only way to live without splitting yourself in half. There's an odd peace that comes from living this way. Not the nothing ever hurts me kind of peace, but the I can face it when it does kind. You stop fearing pain because you realize it doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're feeling. You stop fearing endings because you've learned how to let go without collapsing. You even start forgiving people faster, not because they deserve it, but because you don't want to carry the poison anymore. That's what truth does. It detoxes you from resentment. It unclogs the emotional arteries so your humanity can flow again. And yet, even as you evolve, you never stop being surprised by how hard it is to tell the truth in small, daily ways. The temptation to slip back into convenience never disappears. It's in the I'm fine you say when you're not. The I don't mind you mutter when you do. The sure that's okay that costs you peace of mind. These are micro-lies, the kind that seem harmless until you realize they've built an entire architecture of self-denial. Learning honesty means catching yourself in those tiny betrayals and choosing to show up differently. Not perfectly, just consciously. There's something profoundly funny about how the simplest things are the hardest to do. Being honest, saying no, admitting I don't know. These are beginner-level truths, yet most of us reach midlife still fumbling through them. But that's the beauty of it. Confession is never a finished project. It's maintenance, like watering a plant or cleaning a mirror. You don't confess once and become pure forever. You keep doing it because dust keeps falling. Life keeps happening, and you keep needing to see yourself clearly. Eventually, you start to understand that confession isn't a punishment. It's participation. It's how you stay awake in your own life. Every time you tell the truth, you re-enter reality a little more fully. And the reward for that is presence, the kind of presence that doesn't need an audience, a filter, or a defense. It's the quiet hum of being in alignment with what's real. You might still stumble, you might still lie out of habit, but now you notice it, and that noticing is everything. Because awareness, in its simplest form, is just another kind of confession. And maybe that's where the journey ends. Not in perfection, but in peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've stopped running from yourself. You still have flaws, fears, secrets, but they no longer own you. You can hold them gently now, like old photographs. Reminders of where you've been, not definitions of who you are. You laugh more easily, you forgive faster, you breathe deeper. And as you do, you realize that confession was never just about telling the truth. It was about becoming it. There's something beautifully absurd about the way truth sneaks up on us. It never arrives when we're ready. It doesn't knock politely or wait for a convenient time. It just bursts through the door like a friend who's had too much coffee and no boundaries. You might be brushing your teeth, scrolling your phone, or pretending to listen in a meeting. And suddenly, there it is, a realization so sharp it slices right through the fog. It doesn't even say hello. It just whispers, "You've been lying to yourself again, haven't you?" And in that moment, you feel both exposed and strangely free. Because as much as we fear the truth, we crave it even more. It's oxygen for a soul that's been holding its breath. That's the paradox of honesty. It hurts before it heals. Like disinfectant, it stings first because it's doing its job. We try to avoid that sting by layering ourselves with distractions. Work, relationships, self-improvement, anything that keeps us too busy to notice the splinters. But the truth has patience. It waits. And when it finally catches up to you, it doesn't come with thunder. It comes with quiet precision. A single sentence from someone you love. A pause in your own voice. A mirror you didn't expect to look into. And once it's there, you can't unsee it. You can only decide what to do next. Pretend again or change. Change, though, is a funny word. We talk about it like it's an event, something that happens after a dramatic revelation. But in reality, it's more like bad Wi-Fi. It cuts in and out. It tests your patience. One moment you're enlightened, the next you're back to your old habits, wondering why enlightenment doesn't come with a warranty. Real change isn't a switch. It's a rhythm. It's the slow, clumsy dance between who you were and who you're becoming. And sometimes, confession is the music that keeps you moving. Every time you admit something honest, you reset the tempo of your growth. There's also a strange comedy in how we assume everyone else is doing better at this whole being honest thing. You look around and see people who seem composed, confident, enlightened, and then you discover their inner lives are just as chaotic as yours. That's when you realize we're all improvising. We're all hoping no one notices the script we forgot to write. The polished version of life we see online? That's just the trailer. The real movie is messy, under-edited, full of deleted scenes, and most of it wouldn't pass the censors of polite conversation. Maybe that's why truth feels so revolutionary. It's the one thing that can't be photoshopped. As you get older, you start valuing honesty the way children value candy. It becomes this rare, delicious thing. You can taste when someone's being real, and it hits you differently. It's not always pleasant, but it's nourishing. When someone says, "I don't know," and you exhale because, finally, you're not the only one. Someone admits, "I'm scared." And suddenly your own fears feel a little smaller. Vulnerability becomes a form of generosity. It's like emotional recycling. You share your brokenness, and it becomes someone else's relief. That's when you begin to see confession, not as a burden, but as a bridge. Every truth you share connects you to something larger, another person, another understanding, another layer of yourself. You notice this most in the moments that scare you, when you say something real and brace for rejection, only to find acceptance waiting instead. Or even better, recognition. That quiet moment when someone looks at you and says, "Me too." 2 words that can collapse years of isolation. That's the secret power of truth. It doesn't just heal, it unites. But it's not always soft or poetic. Sometimes truth comes in like a wrecking ball. It dismantles your illusions, your plans, your entire sense of order. And though it feels unfair at first, it's usually clearing space for something better. Think about it. How many times did you think your life was falling apart, only to realize it was just falling into place? The job you lost that led you to purpose. The relationship that ended so you could finally meet yourself. We call it chaos, but it's really correction. The universe has a strange way of rearranging you through discomfort. There's humor in that too. You ever notice how hindsight turns tragedy into comedy? You cry through the moment, but 6 months later you're telling the story at dinner and everyone's laughing, including you. That's confession in disguise. It's your soul's way of saying, "I survived that." Pain, once processed, becomes wisdom. Wisdom, when shared, becomes connection. And connection, that's what keeps us alive. So maybe that's what confession really is, and the art of turning your private pain into communal laughter. Still, we resist it. We resist truth the way a child resists bedtime, fully aware it's for our own good, but convinced we're missing out on something. We convince ourselves that hiding is safer, but hiding is just a slow kind of suffocation. Every unspoken truth becomes a stone in your chest. You carry enough of them, and even breathing feels like a chore, but when you finally start to speak, the stones start to fall away. The relief is so immediate, it's almost funny. You wonder why you didn't do it sooner. And yet, that's part of being human. Learning the same lesson over and over until it finally sticks. You realize, too, that truth doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it arrives through stillness, when you stop trying to explain, justify, or convince. When you just sit there, silent but honest, letting the world see you exactly as you are. That kind of honesty doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. It's enough to simply exist in it. There's a holiness in being unedited, unfiltered, unapologetic. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. And then, quietly, it dawns on you. Maybe confession isn't about cleaning your soul, but about clearing space for it to expand. Every truth spoken, every mask dropped, every laugh that follows a mistake, it all makes room for something wider, more compassion, more curiosity, more life. You start to see truth not as an endpoint, but as a companion. It walks beside you, sometimes dragging you by the collar, but always keeping you honest enough to stay awake. And maybe that's what all of this was leading toward. Not some grand epiphany, but a simple one. That life itself is one long confession. Every day we're admitting something. Our fears, our hopes, our flaws, our small acts of courage. Some days we do it loudly, some days it's barely a whisper. But the point isn't how perfectly we confess. It's that we keep doing it. Because the moment we stop growing. And somewhere deep down we know that truth, however uncomfortable, is what keeps the soul alive. There's a quiet kind of bravery that comes with being honest. Not the loud, cinematic kind, where you stand on a stage and shout your truth to the world, but the soft, trembling kind that happens when no one's watching. It's the courage to face yourself without makeup, metaphorical or otherwise. To sit in front of a mirror, both literal and emotional, and not flinch when it starts talking back. Because mirrors do talk, not with words, but with silence. And silence, as anyone who's ever tried to avoid their reflection knows, can be brutally fluent. It usually starts small. You catch a glimpse of yourself one morning and realize you've been living on autopilot, brushing your teeth, checking your phone, scrolling through other people's highlight reels, all while pretending it's normal. You laugh, because what else can you do? You think of all the times you've said, "I'm fine," when you weren't, and how convincing you've become at performing stability. We all deserve Oscars for how well we fake composure. But the truth is, pretending to be okay is like trying to stop a leak with glitter. It looks fine from a distance, but eventually the water wins. And when it does, confession seeps in. Not in church pews or therapists' offices, though those places have their charm, but in moments of unexpected vulnerability. Maybe it's while you're washing dishes, and you suddenly whisper to no one, "I can't do this anymore." Or during a late-night drive, when your favorite song hits too close to home and you realize it's been narrating your life for years. That's the real confessional. The in-between moments when truth catches you with your guard down and simply says, "Finally." The strange thing about truth is that it doesn't demand perfection. It just demands presence. You don't have to have it all figured out, to be honest. You just have to stop running. But humans, for all our intelligence, are expert runners. We run from our feelings, our memories, our needs. Some of us run into busyness, others into distraction, and a few of us sprint straight into denial with Olympic form. We treat introspection like jury duty, necessary but deeply inconvenient. And yet, avoidance always collects interest. The longer you postpone truth, the more expensive it becomes. But when you finally stop, when you sit still long enough for your thoughts to catch up, something miraculous happens. You start hearing yourself again. Not the noisy self, full of opinions and scripts, but the quiet one underneath. The one that speaks in sensations instead of words. The one that doesn't judge, just observes. Listening to that self feels awkward at first, like talking to a stranger you vaguely recognize. But over time you realize that stranger is the only person who's been with you through everything. The one who knows how many smiles were fake and how many goodbyes were unfinished. There's a kind of humor in it too, because once you start telling the truth, you notice how addicted we all are to pretense. Small talk becomes surreal. "How are you?" Feels like a philosophical question. You catch yourself almost saying, "Fine," and then laughing, because you're not fine and you're tired of pretending you are. So you say something real instead, and the person across from you blinks, startled, as if they've just seen a wild animal wander into a shopping mall. That's how rare honesty has become. But the ripple effect is undeniable. One genuine answer can shift an entire conversation. Suddenly, walls drop. The person who was ready to scroll through your surface starts leaning in. They tell you something they haven't said out loud in years. And for a moment, both of you remember what connection actually feels like. Not the curated, algorithm-approved version, but the messy, unfiltered kind that makes you exhale and think, "Oh, thank God it's not just me." That's the thing about confession. It doesn't just heal the teller, it invites the listener to breathe, too. Still, there's a risk. Honesty rearranges things. You can't tell the truth and expect your life to stay the same. People might drift away. You might lose relationships that were built on illusion. But maybe that's not loss. Maybe it's pruning. The truth has a way of clearing space for what's real to grow. It's painful, yes, but so is carrying what's fake. You can't nurture authenticity while feeding deception. You can't keep the garden in the weeds. Eventually, something has to go. And that's where the real transformation begins. Not in grand confessions or dramatic reinventions, but in small, consistent truth-telling. You start saying no when you mean no. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You choose discomfort over resentment. And life, surprisingly, doesn't collapse. It simplifies. The noise quiets. You realize that most of your stress came not from reality, but from the stories you told to avoid it. Truth doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. And clarity, while often uncomfortable, is the most underrated form of peace. The deeper you go into it, the more you notice that honesty doesn't just connect you to others, it reconnects you to wonder. Because once you strip away the performance, you start noticing life again. The way morning light spills unevenly across the floor. The way laughter sounds different when it's not forced. The way a stranger's kindness can shake something awake inside you. Truth brings you back to your senses, literally. You stop sleepwalking through your days and start seeing how wildly alive the world is. And just when you think you've got the hang of it, truth plays its favorite trick. It humbles you. Because honesty, at its core, is a practice in humility. It reminds you that you don't have all the answers, that you're constantly learning, unlearning, and relearning what it means to be human. It's both freeing and frustrating. You'll mess it up over and over again. You'll lie to yourself, catch it, forgive yourself, and start again. And maybe that's the beauty of it, that being truthful isn't about being flawless, it's about being awake. Eventually, you start laughing more. Not because everything's funny, but because you finally understand that imperfection is inevitable. You stop needing to be right all the time. You stop taking yourself so seriously. You realize that most of the drama in life comes from the refusal to admit simple truths. I was wrong. I don't know. I care. I'm scared. And once you start saying those things, you don't just become more honest, you become more alive. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of it all. That confession, at its heart, isn't about guilt or morality. It's about aliveness. It's about being so present in your own skin that you stop rehearsing your humanity and start inhabiting it. You breathe deeper. You listen better. You laugh louder. You begin to understand that truth, no matter how heavy, is never your enemy. It's the hand pulling you back into yourself. And as you take it, trembling but willing, you realize that honesty was never about perfection. It was about belonging to life, to others, and finally to yourself. The most curious thing about truth is that it always starts as an inconvenience. No one wakes up in the morning saying, you know what would make my day perfect? A little self-awareness. Truth interrupts. It's like a guest who shows up uninvited but still manages to eat all your food and rearrange your furniture, and yet somehow you end up grateful they came. Because underneath the discomfort, something begins to shift. There's a relief that comes from no longer needing to pretend. A lightness that feels suspicious at first, like joy you haven't earned yet. But it's real. It's the peace that grows in the space where denial used to live. The trouble is that most of us treat truth like a dentist appointment. We know we need it, but we'll reschedule it forever. We tell ourselves we're not ready, or that it's not the right time, as if there's ever a perfect moment to dismantle your own illusions. But life, patient as it is, doesn't wait for permission. It keeps sending reminders. The sleepless nights, the growing distance in a conversation, the way your chest tightens when you smile at the wrong thing. Those are truth's calling cards. Ignore them long enough and they start showing up louder, through heartbreaks, breakdowns, or the kind of silence that no music can drown out. Still, even in the middle of all that discomfort, there's humor to be found. Humans are hilariously bad at lying to themselves gracefully. You'll see it everywhere. The coworker who insists they love their job while twitching through another Zoom meeting, the couple saying, we're just tired. When what they really mean is, we've been emotionally ghosting each other for 6 months. Or the friend who posts new beginnings every 3 weeks but hasn't actually left the old one yet. It's almost endearing, this desperate optimism we call denial. Like watching a cat try to fit into a box that's clearly too small. You can't even be mad at it. It's just part of being human. But when the box finally breaks, when the truth spills out, something beautiful happens. It doesn't destroy you the way you feared. It rebuilds you in ways you didn't know you needed. Because the truth isn't just revelation, it's renovation. It tears down the walls you outgrew and replaces them with windows. You start seeing everything differently, not because the world changed, but because your vision cleared. It's like cleaning your glasses after years of smudges you thought were normal. Suddenly, things make sense. The patterns, the pain, the choices. You see the part you played, and instead of hating yourself, you finally understand yourself. That understanding brings with it a strange form of forgiveness. Not the kind you give others, but the kind you give yourself. Because, let's be honest, we all have chapters we'd rather skip. The decisions made out of fear, the words we can't take back, the people we lost because we were too proud to stay. For a long time, those memories sit like stains you keep trying to scrub out. But eventually, you realize they're not stains. They're layers. The proof that you've lived, that you've risked, that you've learned the hard way. And honestly, the hard way might be the only way we ever really learn. It's just less efficient and far more interesting. It's also kind of funny how we romanticize the idea of starting over. We imagine rebirth as this clean, cinematic thing, a new haircut, a flight somewhere tropical, a dramatic caption about self-discovery. But real rebirth? It's ugly. It's crying in the shower. It's deleting and re-downloading the same app of bad decisions 3 times in 1 week. It's learning to sit with yourself without needing to be entertained. But that's where the real transformation hides. Not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet discipline of choosing truth over comfort, again and again. And once you start living that way, you notice how honesty changes your rhythm. Conversations feel less like performances and more like exchanges. You stop rehearsing what to say and start listening for what's real. People feel it too. They might not always like it, but they respect it. Because authenticity, when done right, is magnetic. It's not about being loud or raw for the sake of it. It's about alignment. The peace that comes from knowing your insides finally match your outsides. And in a world where everything is curated, that kind of congruence feels almost rebellious. But truth, in its most mischievous form, doesn't just reveal who you are. It reveals what you've been avoiding. It points to the things you still hold on to for safety. The job that drains you, the relationship that no longer fits, the version of yourself you've outgrown but can't stop performing. The funny part is, we treat letting go like it's death, when it's actually birth. You're not losing identity. You're shedding costume. The role you played was never meant to be permanent. You can almost laugh at how long you stayed at the costume party after everyone else went home. Of course, there's a cost to this kind of honesty. You lose the illusion of control. You can't manipulate perception the same way anymore. You start saying, I don't know more often, and though that used to sound weak, now it feels honest. You start apologizing differently too. Not with guilt, but with accountability. I was wrong stops being a confession of shame and becomes a declaration of growth. That's when you know you're changing. When the truth no longer terrifies you, it teaches you. There's a story about a monk who said that enlightenment wasn't a lightning bolt, but a long, slow cleaning of the window between you and reality. Each act of honesty, each confession, wipes away a bit of dust. It's a patient process, and sometimes a funny one, because just when you think your window is spotless, life throws another handful of dirt at it. You sigh, laugh, and start wiping again. That's what living consciously really is. Not a final state, but a practice, a daily habit of clarity. And the more you practice it, the more you realize how contagious it is. Your honesty becomes a permission slip for others. You start meeting people who speak without masks, who listen without agendas, who laugh at their own flaws like it's a form of prayer. Those are the people truth attracts, the ones who aren't afraid of depth or silence or laughter that borders on tears. Being around them feels like standing in sunlight after years underground. You don't have to earn their acceptance because they're too busy being real themselves, and maybe that's where the journey leads, not toward some perfect version of you, but toward a version that no longer hides. The kind that can look at their own contradictions and say, yes, this is me, still a work in progress, still figuring it out. Because the goal of confession isn't purity, it's presence. It's the ability to exist without editing yourself to fit someone else's comfort. To wake up, look in the mirror, and not need to apologize to your reflection. So you keep telling the truth, not because it's easy, but because it's lighter. You keep laughing through the discomfort, forgiving your younger self and letting the present one stumble forward. And in those small, ordinary acts of honesty, you realize something extraordinary. That confession was never about escaping who you were. It was about finally coming home to who you are. Unpolished, unfiltered, imperfectly human, and entirely enough. There's a strange thing that happens when you start living honestly. Life doesn't suddenly get easier. It just gets real. The drama doesn't disappear, but it stops being scripted. You stop performing pain for sympathy and start feeling it for understanding. That's when you realize honesty isn't a virtue, it's a survival strategy. Because nothing corrodes the soul faster than pretending to be someone you're not. Pretending exhausts you in ways that sleep can't fix. You can drink all the green juice and do all the yoga in the world, but if you're lying to yourself, you're just a flexible hypocrite with good hydration. Truth, though, doesn't need to be dramatic. It often enters quietly, almost shyly. You might catch it during the smallest moment, like saying yes to something you don't want to do, feeling that microsecond of inner resistance and realizing, oh, there it is again, the betrayal of self disguised as politeness. And you laugh, because it's absurd how many times you've done it. You think you're being kind, but what you're really being is dishonest. That's when you start noticing that people who never say no often end up resentful. And resentment, when left unchecked, is just unspoken truth trying to escape through sarcasm. That's probably why humor is such an effective way of telling the truth. It sneaks honesty into places where seriousness would be rejected. A joke can disarm what an argument can't. You've seen it happen. Someone cracks a line that's funny because it's true, and suddenly the whole room is laughing and reflecting at the same time. Laughter is a strange mirror. It lets us see ourselves without flinching. Maybe that's why the people who make us laugh the most are often the ones who understand pain the best. Comedy isn't the opposite of confession. It's its twin, dressed in irony. And somewhere along the way, you learn that confession doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it's just between you and the universe, or maybe between you and the part of yourself you've ignored for too long. You start having those internal conversations that sounds like, why do I keep saying I'm fine when I'm obviously not? Or why do I keep chasing people who don't choose me back? And at first the answers sting, but then beneath the sting, there's something softer, compassion. You realize that most of your self-deception wasn't evil, it was protective. You lie to yourself because the truth wasn't safe to face yet. The body and mind have their own timing for revelation. The irony is that once you start telling the truth, you also start laughing at how complicated you made everything. The drama, the excuses, the stories, all elaborate ways of avoiding three simple words. I was wrong, or worse, I don't know. It's funny how terrifying it is to admit uncertainty in a world obsessed with confidence, but there's a strange relief in it too. Not knowing is freedom. Because once you stop pretending to have all the answers, you finally make room for curiosity. And curiosity, unlike ego, doesn't need to win. It just wants to understand. The curiosity spills over into how you see others too. You start recognizing that everyone's hiding something, not because they're deceptive, but because they're afraid. The friend who's always joking might be deflecting sadness. The coworker who's always so busy might be avoiding loneliness. The relative who keeps giving you advice might just be projecting their own regrets. You stop taking things personally, and that changes everything. Because once you understand that people's behavior is rarely about you, you stop performing for their approval and start living for your alignment. And then you notice something even stranger. Honesty makes you softer, not harder. Before, you thought truth would make you blunt or cruel, like some prophet with a sword of justice. But real truth doesn't slice, it soothes, it doesn't shout, it hums. It makes you kind because you start to see the difference between being nice and being genuine. Niceness wants to be liked, honesty wants to be real, and people can feel the difference. Niceness is sugar, pleasant but fleeting. Honesty is salt, and sometimes sharp, but it gives everything flavor. That's also when you begin to understand that confession, in its deepest sense, isn't about guilt at all. It's about alignment. It's saying, this is where I actually am, instead of, this is where I wish I were. You stop editing your emotions to make them more palatable. You stop sanitizing your story so it sounds more noble. You even stop trying to be spiritual all the time, because you realize enlightenment doesn't mean escaping humanity. It means inhabiting it fully, and in that raw, unfiltered presence, something sacred starts to happen. Life stops being a test and starts being an experience. Of course, that doesn't mean you suddenly become a beacon of flawless truth-telling. There will still be moments when you catch yourself slipping into old patterns, the polite lie, the half-truth, the silence that speaks volumes. But instead of judging yourself, you laugh. Because awareness itself is progress. You can't unsee what you've seen. Once the curtain of self-deception falls, it never fully rises again. That's both humbling and hilarious. To realize you've been your own magician, sawing yourself in half for years just to get applause. And as the days go on, honesty starts bleeding into everything. Your work, your relationships, even the way you talk to strangers. You find yourself saying things like, I actually don't know how to do that, or that hurt me, or that made my day, without overthinking how it sounds. You become transparent, not because it's trendy, but because it's easier. Pretending, you realize, is a full-time job with no benefits. Telling the truth might make you vulnerable, but at least it pays in peace. It's not just emotional peace either. There's something physical about it. Your body starts to unclench, your breath slows down, you stop grinding your teeth at night. It's as if honesty recalibrates your nervous system. Scientists might call it stress reduction, but it feels more spiritual than that, like your cells are finally exhaling. It's almost comical how tangible it is. You'd think truth was intangible, but it lives in your muscles, your heartbeat, your digestion. Every lie is stored somewhere until you let it out. Confession, quite literally, helps you digest life. And maybe that's why, at its core, truth always feels like coming home. Not to a house or a person, but to yourself. You recognize your own thoughts again, unfiltered and unafraid. You start trusting your instincts. That quiet voice you used to ignore because it didn't sound confident enough. Turns out that voice was never weak. It was just soft. It never yelled because it didn't need to. It was waiting for you to stop talking long enough to listen. That's the full circle of it all. You spend your life chasing meaning, validation, love, forgiveness, and then one day you realize they all live in the same place, inside the truth. It was never hiding from you. You were hiding from it. And when you finally stop, when you stand still long enough to let honesty catch up, the world doesn't collapse, it opens. You feel it, that quiet expansion that feels like breathing for the first time. And in that breath, you understand something that no philosophy book could teach you, that confession was never about saying the right thing. It was about returning to yourself, laughing through the process, and realizing you were never as lost as you thought, just temporarily misquoted by your own fear. The truth has a strange sense of humor. It waits until you've spent years building your perfect little version of reality. Every detail polished, every emotion tucked neatly behind logic. And then it taps you on the shoulder and says, cute, but let's try that again. And there you are, standing in the ruins of your own certainty, realizing that honesty isn't about being right. It's about being real, which, unfortunately, tends to be far messier and far funnier than we'd like to admit. It's odd how people assume truth comes with clarity. In practice, it's more like a fog that moves in slowly, revealing one uncomfortable detail at a time. You don't get the full picture all at once, just fragments. The job you thought defined you starts feeling meaningless. The relationship that looked perfect on Instagram begins to feel like performance art. You tell yourself it's just a phase, but deep down you know the script is wearing thin. And the moment you finally say it out loud, the world doesn't end. It just sighs in relief, like it was waiting for you to catch up. What's ironic is that we spend so much energy avoiding this exact moment, the crack in the facade, even though it's where everything worthwhile begins. Most breakthroughs arrive disguised as breakdowns. You think you're falling apart, but you're really just running out of lies. The body knows it first. You feel it in your chest, in your sleep, in the way your smile feels slightly off-key. That's your conscience whispering, we can't keep this up forever. And of course, you try. You double down, you rationalize, you drown the discomfort in distractions. But the truth doesn't compete for attention. It just waits. patiently, until you're tired enough to listen. When you finally do, something shifts. Not instantly, but quietly, like the slow untying of a knot. You stop rushing to fill silences. You start saying, "I don't know," more often. You stop treating vulnerability like a disease to be cured. It's humbling, this new honesty, because it strips you of control. But in that surrender, you find something you didn't expect. Peace. Not the Instagram kind with sunsets and candles, but the raw kind that shows up when you stop editing yourself for approval. It's fascinating how honesty has this way of sneaking into your smallest moments. You notice it while ordering coffee, when you stop pretending to like oat milk. You feel it in conversation, when you admit you've outgrown certain people but wish them well anyway. It's not dramatic, it's subtle. Like returning to your natural tone after years of speaking in accents to make others comfortable. And once you hear your real voice again, you can't unhear it. It doesn't roar, it resonates. And yet, the funniest part about truth is how unglamorous it actually is. Everyone talks about living authentically like it's some poetic awakening. But half the time, it's just uncomfortable logistics. It's canceling plans because you're exhausted, not mysterious. It's apologizing without the word but. It's realizing your moral high ground is built on a hill of double standards. That's the kind of honesty no one puts on motivational posters, but it's the kind that actually transforms you. You start understanding that confession, in its truest sense, isn't about punishment, it's about alignment. You're not asking for forgiveness, you're seeking coherence. It's exhausting, after all, to live divided between what you say and what you feel. But the moment those two things merge, life gets lighter. You stop carrying so many versions of yourself, you stop needing to remember which story you told to whom. Honesty simplifies life, not because it makes it easier, but because it removes the clutter of pretending. There's something deeply human about watching yourself evolve in real time, like discovering that you were both the villain and the hero all along. You begin to forgive the version of you that lied, not out of malice, but out of fear. Because fear, when you look closely, is just unprocessed honesty. The fear of being rejected is often the fear of being known. The fear of failure is the fear of admitting what you really want. When you finally translate those fears into words, they lose their grip. You realize that most of the monsters you've been running from were just truths waiting for compassion. Of course, this kind of transformation comes with side effects. People around you might not know what to do with your newfound clarity. You'll see it in their eyes, that mix of admiration and discomfort. Some will say you've changed, as if that's an accusation. Others will quietly distance themselves, not because they hate your honesty, but because it reminds them of their own noise. That's not your cue to shrink, it's your cue to keep going. The world doesn't need more agreeable people, it needs more real ones. But even as you grow bolder, there's still humor in how fragile we all remain. You'll find yourself having these small, ridiculous moments, like rehearsing difficult conversations in the shower or trying to sound casually authentic while telling someone how you actually feel. The irony of practicing sincerity never gets old. Yet those awkward attempts are proof of progress. You're trying. And that's the beauty of it. Truth doesn't require perfection, just participation. Somewhere along the journey, you stop seeing confession as a single act and start seeing it as a rhythm. Every day becomes an opportunity to realign. Sometimes it's a deep truth, like admitting you're still healing from something you thought you'd moved on from. Other times, it's small, like finally throwing away the shirt that no longer feels like you. The size of the confession doesn't matter, the courage does, because courage isn't about fearlessness, it's about honesty in motion. And gradually, you notice that life begins to meet you halfway. The more authentic you become, the more authentic people you attract. You start having conversations that feed your soul instead of drain it. You laugh more, not the polite social kind, but the belly-deep kind that shakes something awake inside you. You feel grounded, not because everything's perfect, but because you're no longer pretending it is. The world, in turn, starts to feel a little less hostile because you're no longer fighting it with masks. It's in those moments that you realize something profound. Confession was never about unburdening yourself from sin. It was about uncluttering yourself from illusion. It's about remembering that you don't need to be extraordinary to be worthy. You just need to be honest enough to exist as you are, moment by moment. That kind of truth doesn't shout. It hums quietly in the background of your life, like a steady heartbeat. And once you've tuned into it, you don't go back. You can't. Because the taste of authenticity, once swallowed, ruins your appetite for pretense forever. And maybe that's the point. Not to be flawless or fearless, but to be awake. To walk through this strange, messy, beautiful world unarmored, unpolished, and unafraid of being seen, not as who you were, not as who you're trying to be, but as who you are right now. That, in itself, is the purest confession of all. The courage to simply be, without rehearsal, without disguise, and without apology. It's funny how the truth always seems to find the one place you least want it to go. The quiet parts, the places you thought were safe because no one else could see them. But that's exactly where truth likes to hide. Waiting for the right moment to tap you on the shoulder and whisper, You missed a spot. You can almost laugh at the timing of it. It never arrives during the calm. It shows up when you're late for something, or when you finally think you've moved on, or when you're halfway through a sentence you don't really mean. Truth doesn't care about convenience. It only cares about accuracy. And accuracy, unfortunately, tends to be uncomfortable. What's interesting is that the more you run from it, the more creative it becomes at catching you. You try to bury it under busyness, and it starts showing up in your exhaustion. You drown it in distraction, and it sneaks into your dreams. You silence it with logic, and it starts speaking through your body. The tension, the sleepless nights, the quiet unease that hums beneath every "I'm fine." The truth isn't cruel, it's persistent. It's like gravity, patient, invisible, inevitable. You can ignore it for years, but it always pulls you back to yourself in the end. And when it finally does, the confrontation feels both terrifying and oddly familiar. Because deep down, you always knew. The signs were there. The discomfort when someone mentioned that topic, the defensiveness that flared when you were too close to honesty. But it's easier to stay blind when your comfort depends on not seeing. You convince yourself that denial is peace, but it's not. It's just delayed pain with interest. And yet, when the truth finally catches up, something remarkable happens. You don't shatter. You expand. You realize that the thing you feared most, being exposed, was never as dangerous as the act of hiding. The act of hiding, in fact, is exhausting. It turns life into a stage play where you never get to leave character. You have to remember your lines. Keep your costume clean. Stay in lighting that flatters the story. It's no wonder so many people confuse burnout with being busy. They're just tired of pretending. But the moment you step off stage, the air feels different, thicker, real. You can finally breathe again. There's a strange lightness in not needing to be impressive anymore. You stop worrying about applause and start caring about authenticity. And once you taste that kind of freedom, you can't go back to the script. There's a certain comedy in realizing how much of your identity was built on things you never questioned, the opinions you inherited, the dreams you borrowed, the fears that weren't even yours to begin with. It's like realizing you've been living in a house decorated by strangers. You look around and think, wait, who chose this wallpaper? That's when self-honesty stops being an abstract concept and starts feeling like renovation. You don't destroy the whole house. You just start removing what doesn't belong anymore. And yes, it's messy. Dust everywhere, emotional furniture scattered around. But when the air clears, you finally recognize your own reflection in the space. And the more you live in that renovated version of yourself, the more you notice how contagious truth is. It's like fresh air. When you start breathing it, other people start craving it too. You begin attracting conversations that matter, relationships that don't demand performance, laughter that doesn't require irony. It's as if honesty itself shifts the gravitational pull of your world. People who prefer illusion quietly drift away, and those who value realness show up, often in unexpected forms. You stop chasing and start aligning. The right ones don't need to be convinced, they just recognize you. Of course, this kind of honesty doesn't make you immune to mistakes. It just makes you better at learning from them. You stop needing to be right all the time because being real is far more satisfying. You find humor in your contradictions. You laugh at your own hypocrisy. You admit that sometimes you want peace, but also revenge, and that's okay. You're human, not a saint. The paradoxes stop scaring you because you finally understand that honesty isn't about purity. It's about integration. You're not trying to erase the messy parts. You're trying to make peace with them, and that peace comes with a subtle but powerful shift. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You realize that the relationships built on honesty feel calmer, not colder. You used to equate love with chaos, confession with drama. Now you see that real connection doesn't need theatrics. It's quieter, steadier, less performative. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility, and that saves you years of emotional gymnastics. You start choosing people who don't require you to shrink or pretend, and suddenly the simplest moments, shared silence, a knowing glance, feel sacred. But here's the most unexpected part. The deeper you go into truth, the funnier life becomes. Because once you stop taking your false self so seriously, you start seeing the absurdity of everything. The universe itself seems to have a sense of humor. You spend years praying for answers, only to realize they were hiding in the questions you avoided. You chase meaning in grand ideas, only to find it in something mundane, like the smell of rain on pavement or the way light hits a coffee cup in the morning. Truth simplifies life so much it almost feels like a prank. It strips away all the unnecessary drama until all that's left is the beautiful, bewildering fact that you're alive. That simplicity doesn't mean passivity, it means clarity. You still chase dreams, but now you know why. You still love people, but now you know how. You stop expecting every moment to be monumental and start appreciating the quiet constancy of honesty. You even forgive more easily, not because you've become a saint, but because resentment feels like too much maintenance. You start letting things go, not because they don't matter, but because you finally understand what does. And somewhere in all this, you realize that confession was never really about admitting the past. It was about reclaiming the present. Every truth you speak, every illusion you release brings you closer to reality. Not the one society scripts, but the one that breathes. You stop living for the version of yourself that others remember and start living for the one who's still evolving. You stop looking for meaning as something to achieve and start recognizing it as something you create, moment by moment, through the way you show up. By then, truth stops being something you say and becomes something you are. It radiates through the smallest things, the way you speak to strangers, the way you rest without guilt, the way you listen without needing to fix. You find that life, stripped of pretense, doesn't lose its color. It becomes more vivid. The highs feel cleaner, the lows less permanent. Even uncertainty feels like adventure rather than threat. You stop chasing control and start trusting flow. And maybe that's what confession was leading you toward all along. Not purity, not perfection, but presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need a story to justify itself. The kind that lets you laugh at your past, forgive your mistakes, and still have enough wonder left to keep exploring what it means to be human. Because in the end, the truth was never a destination. It was the road beneath your feet, uneven, unpredictable, and infinitely worth walking. There's something deeply ironic about how we spend half our lives trying to hide our flaws, and the other half trying to convince people we've embraced them. Somewhere between those two performances, the truth gets lost. Quiet, patient, waiting for the noise to die down. Because that's what truth is. Patient. It doesn't demand your attention, it simply waits until your pretending becomes too heavy to carry. Then when you finally drop the act, often by accident, it shows up like an old friend you didn't realize you'd missed. It usually happens in small, forgettable moments. You're brushing your teeth, staring at your reflection, and suddenly you feel it. That strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, it's just a quiet awareness that you've been negotiating with yourself for too long. You remember all the times you said yes when you meant no, or stayed silent when you wanted to scream, or smiled when you were breaking. And you realize how much energy went into maintaining peace at the expense of truth. And in that split second, something shifts. You stop wanting to be admired and start craving authenticity. The funny part is that truth never asks for an audience. It doesn't care about optics or applause. It's the only thing in the world that gets stronger the less you perform it. You don't have to announce it, you just have to live it. But of course, we're not wired for that. We're trained to narrate our lives like a press release. Even our vulnerability comes with good lighting and captions. We've turned confession into content, like honesty only counts if it's shared in high definition. And yet, some of the most transformative truths are the ones whispered in solitude when there's no one to validate them but yourself. Once you start telling yourself the truth, really telling it, without editing or justification, you realize how much of your suffering came from your own resistance. Not from the truth itself, but from the war against it. We think pain comes from honesty, but most of it comes from postponing honesty. It's like pulling off a bandage in slow motion. All agony, no progress. But once you rip it off, the wound finally gets to breathe. That's the paradox. Truth hurts less than illusion. It just hurts sooner. You start noticing how much your body keeps score of unspoken truths. The headaches, the insomnia, the tension in your jaw, all quiet rebellions against the lies you tell to stay comfortable. It's strange how physical honesty can feel. When you finally say what you've been avoiding, it's not just emotional relief, it's physiological. You exhale differently, your shoulders drop, even your heart rate changes. Science might call it parasympathetic activation, but anyone who's ever told the truth after years of silence knows it as liberation. And then comes the comedy of it. The absurdity of realizing how much effort you've wasted maintaining a version of yourself that no one else even believed. You look back and think, was I really that committed to the bit? You were the actor, the director, the costume designer, and the critic, all working overtime for a show no one bought tickets to. But instead of feeling ashamed, you start laughing. Because that's the magic of self-awareness. It turns tragedy into stand-up material. And when you stop taking your ego so seriously, life becomes far more entertaining. Honesty also changes the way you connect with others. You stop performing relatability and start practicing presence. You don't need to impress anyone anymore because you've made peace with being understood by few and misinterpreted by many. You start realizing that deep connection doesn't come from shared perfection, but shared imperfection. The mutual recognition that we're all improvising. The best conversations aren't the ones where everyone agrees. They're the ones where everyone tells the truth, even when it's messy, awkward, or unfinished. It's in those moments of rawness that humanity feels most alive. You see it in small things. Someone admitting, I'm scared, without laughing it off. A friend confessing they're tired of pretending to be okay. Or even in yourself when you admit you don't have it all figured out and stop apologizing for it. Those are the moments that stitch people together, not the polished confessions rehearsed for applause. It's the imperfection that connects us, not the performance of growth. The paradox, though, is that the more honest you become, the lonelier it can feel at first. You realize how much of the world is built on polite dishonesty. the let's catch up soon promises, the I'm fine autopilot, the forced optimism that passes for emotional maturity. You start craving deeper waters in a world addicted to small talk. It's isolating at first, but then you find your people, the ones who'd rather have an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable lie. They're rare, but when you meet them, it feels like oxygen. And somewhere along that path, you start noticing how honesty and compassion are not opposites, but partners. The kindest thing you can do for yourself or others is tell the truth. Not the weaponized version of it, but the gentle, necessary kind. The kind that heals instead of humiliates. There's an art to it, saying what's real without trying to win, listening without trying to fix. It's harder than it sounds, because most of us don't really listen. We reload. We wait for our turn to respond, to defend, to explain. But when you strip that away, when you just sit there in shared truth, even if it's uncomfortable, something sacred happens. That sacredness isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It feels like quiet alignment, like every cell in your body finally agreeing on the same story. You realize that confession was never about emptying yourself of guilt. It was about making space for truth to live in you without resistance. It's not about fixing your past, but freeing your present. You stop trying to be pure and start trying to be whole. And wholeness, you discover, is much more forgiving than perfection. Then one day, you catch yourself smiling at something that would have made you anxious before. You realize that truth has softened you, not hardened you. It hasn't made you cynical. It's made you grounded. You no longer chase people to believe your version of reality because you finally believe it yourself. You stop fearing contradictions because you've made peace with being a mosaic. Beautiful, not in spite of your cracks, but because of them. And maybe that's what the journey has been about all along. Not confession as a single act, but as a way of living. A continuous unfolding of honesty that never ends, only deepens. You keep finding new truths inside old ones, like layers of paint revealing the original wall beneath. You don't chase enlightenment anymore. You practice honesty instead. Because at the end of it all, truth doesn't ask you to be perfect. It just asks you to be present. And there's nothing more human or more freeing than that. Standing in the full light of yourself, flawed, funny, and utterly alive. Finally realizing that the greatest confession isn't spoken to someone else. It's whispered inward. I'm done pretending. This is me. At some point, you realize that confession isn't a ritual. It's a rhythm. Not something you do once to cleanse yourself, but something that becomes the natural pulse of your life. It's in the quiet honesty of saying, I'm not okay today. It's in the courage to tell someone, I don't love this version of myself right now, but I'm working on it. It's in the small moments when you stop performing strength and start practicing truth. That's where real transformation begins. Not in the grand declarations of change, but in the daily maintenance of sincerity. The strange thing about living truthfully is that it doesn't make life easier. If anything, it complicates it at first. Suddenly, you can't ignore what you used to overlook. The jokes that were once funny now feel hollow. The job that once paid well now feels like spiritual tax. You start craving meaning like oxygen, and you wonder how you ever survived on so little of it. But then, somewhere in that discomfort, you notice a quiet power growing, the kind that comes from not needing to explain yourself anymore. You're no longer negotiating with your conscience. You're aligned, even if that alignment costs you approval. And oh, approval, that elusive drug. We chase it like it's oxygen, when really it's sugar. Sweet at first, but it always leaves you hungrier. The more you rely on it, the less you taste your own authenticity. Living honestly means quitting that addiction cold turkey. It means getting comfortable with disappointment, not just from others, but from yourself. Because you'll discover that even your ego will protest, whispering, but what will they think? And the answer, of course, is the punchline of the century. They won't think about you nearly as much as you think they do. That realization alone is worth laughing about. We spend so much of our lives narrating imaginary conversations in our heads, defending ourselves to people who aren't even in the room. You catch yourself doing it, rehearsing, rewriting, perfecting your imaginary statements, and suddenly it hits you how absurd it all is. Nobody's keeping score. Nobody's watching that closely. Everyone's too busy managing their own insecurities. It's liberating and a little depressing, like realizing the world isn't a stage. It's an open mic night where everyone forgot their lines. Once you stop trying to impress the invisible audience, something beautiful happens. Authenticity stops feeling like rebellion and starts feeling like relief. You become allergic to pretense. You no longer laugh to fill silence or nod to avoid conflict. You stop forcing I love you when what you really mean is I'm afraid of losing you. Wodungs. The simplicity of truth starts to feel luxurious, like clean air after years of breathing smoke. And people notice, not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. There's a calmness to honesty that feels magnetic. It doesn't demand attention. It invites resonance. The beauty of living this way is that you start noticing how everything in nature already operates by the same law. Trees don't apologize for shedding their leaves. Rivers don't ask permission to carve through rock. Even the moon doesn't hide its phases. It just waxes and wanes unapologetically. Everything alive is honest about its process except us. We're the only creatures who think pretending is progress. Maybe that's why so many of us feel disconnected. We're too busy curating our existence instead of living it. And yet, the universe rewards authenticity in strange ways. The more real you become, the more real things start showing up. The right people find you, the right opportunities open, and even your timing feels different. Less forced, more fluid. It's as if life itself breathes easier when you stop holding your breath. You realize that the truth doesn't repel what's meant for you. It refines it. It filters out what can't meet you at your truest level. But truth also comes with humor. Because even as you evolve, you'll still trip over your old habits. You'll still overthink. You'll still say something you didn't mean, or mean something you didn't say. And then, instead of spiraling, you'll laugh. Because growth doesn't mean never falling. It means falling with better posture. You stop punishing yourself for being human and start appreciating how beautifully chaotic that humanity is. That's when confession stops being heavy and starts being hilarious. The absurdity of trying to control life becomes too obvious not to laugh at. You also begin to notice how confession isn't just personal, it's collective. When one person tells the truth, it gives everyone around them permission to exhale. Think about it. How many times have you heard someone admit something you were too afraid to say and suddenly felt lighter? That's the contagion of honesty. It's not loud or viral, it's quiet and revolutionary. Every act of truth ripples outward, softening the collective tension that comes from pretending. We're all just waiting for someone to go first. And sometimes, going first means telling the truth even when your voice shakes. Especially when it shakes. Because trembling honesty is still stronger than polished deceit. You find out that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear have the final word. And every time you choose truth over comfort, something inside you strengthens. It's subtle at first, like building muscle you didn't know you had. But one day, you look back and realize how far you've come. Not because you climbed, but because you stopped hiding. That's the quiet reward of confession. It restores your integrity, which is just another word for wholeness. You stop living in fragments. Your mind, body, and heart finally speak the same language again. You no longer wake up dreading your own reflection or rehearsing who to be that day. You just are. That just is everything. It's not passive, it's powerful. It's the freedom of no longer needing to earn your own existence. And yet, even in that wholeness, life stays unpredictable. You'll still face heartbreak, loss, confusion, but they don't crush you anymore because you're not fragile from pretending. You meet difficulty with presence instead of performance. You no longer rush to explain or fix it. You sit with it because you've learned that pain, too, is a kind of confession. The body's way of saying, I'm still here. And when you can hold that truth without running from it, you realize that healing isn't about erasing the pain. It's about finally hearing what it's been trying to tell you. In the end, that's what all confession leads to. Listening. Not just to others, but to yourself, to life, to the silent intelligence behind everything that ever hurt or healed you. You start trusting that even the parts you once rejected had something sacred to teach you. You stop seeing yourself as a collection of mistakes and start seeing yourself as a living conversation between truth and transformation. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real laughter comes from. The kind that bubbles up not because something's funny, but because something's finally real. It's the laughter of release, of recognition, of knowing that after all the pretending, all the hiding, all the stories, you've arrived. Not at perfection, but at presence. You're not confessing anymore. You're simply existing honestly, and for the first time, that feels like enough.